Max Emberley, The Seventh Legacy of Drayan, Book 1, Ancient Awakening. Chapter 1, Drayan.
Snow fell in a furious dance beyond the tall windows of Naumburg Keep. The storm had swallowed the mountains whole. The world outside was nothing but white and shadow. Inside, the great hearth burned low, its amber light spilling across stone walls and glinting on the silver-threaded tapestries of the chamber. On a large bed covered with blankets and furs, Alexandra climbed off the large, dark-skinned man and moved aside. She covered her naked body and breathed a sigh of relief. Drops of sweat still clung to her skin. "You were wonderful, as always," said the man, who was red and sweaty, as if he had just come off the battlefield. "You always say that when we're done, Canar," replied the woman, turning her head toward him and looking him straight in the eyes. "Because it's true," said the man, kissing her on the shoulder. "You think I'll believe that?" she asked, pulling away from him. She sat down on the edge of the bed and straightened up. Her long, gently curled light brown hair fell over her shoulders and breasts like a waterfall. Alexandra got out of bed, put on a dark green silk robe, and walked over to the dresser with a mirror. She sat down on a chair and picked up a comb. Looking at herself in the mirror, she began to brush her hair. Alexandra liked to look at her reflection. Every time her gaze met those large gray eyes in the mirror, eyes full of fire and edge, she was reminded of who she was, or perhaps who she had become. She was the second daughter of King Roman II, the Golden Hand, and Queen Lizareth of House Nom. A princess of Drayan by birthright, raised from childhood in the opulence and order of royal blood. Power and privilege had been her companions since the cradle. Yet, for much of her life, she struggled to love herself, as others seemed to love her crown. She had grown up in the royal court of Tangane, the capital of Drayan, alongside her elder sister Milieth and their younger brother Eurystel. Her sister Milieth, 5 years older, was the very image of femininity, a vision of grace and gentleness. Her long golden hair shimmered like sunlight on still water, and her eyes held a quiet warmth that could soften even the hardest of hearts. She moved through the world with effortless kindness, her laughter bright, and her voice like spring rain. Children and animals were drawn to her as if by instinct, sensing the purity of her spirit. Among her people, she was cherished not only for her beauty, but for the softness of her soul. To men, she was a lady to be revered. To all, she was a symbol of the gentleness and strength that true grace can hold. However, Alexandra had been her sister's contrast, the flame beside the candle. Her beauty was vivid where Milieth's was serene, her spirit restless where her sister's was calm. From an early age, she showed the heart of a warrior, proud, daring, unwilling to play the helpless maiden waiting for rescue. Her defiance made her less adored at court, but unforgettable to those who truly saw her. She admired Milieth deeply, envied her softness, and yet refused to mimic it. Everything changed the day the royal family journeyed west to visit their aunt, Lady Arieth, in her mountain stronghold. Arieth was unlike any woman Alexandra had ever known. Fierce, radiant, and wholly unashamed of her strength. Though some whispered she lacked womanly grace, her husband, Lord Radort, would have moved mountains for her. Even in her 40s, admirers followed her like moths to flame. It was there, in that cold and windswept castle, that Alexandra's life began to shift. Lady Arieth saw through her defenses and taught her the subtler art of power, that allure was not born only of softness, but of certainty, that fire, when mastered, could draw just as many hearts as light. Under her aunt's guidance, Alexandra learned to wield her boldness as a weapon and her confidence as a crown. When she returned to Tangane, she was no longer the overlooked sister. She carried herself with new poise, her words honeyed but sharp, her gaze steady and unreadable. In time, the whispers of the court changed their tune. The once rebellious girl had become the kingdom's most desired woman, admired, feared, and never truly possessed. She played the game of hearts with grace and cunning, granting smiles, but never surrendering her freedom. And though many adored her, Alexandra often wondered, in the quiet of her chamber, whether she had gained power or merely lost the part of herself that once longed to be loved. It was love that Alexandra often doubted the existence of. She had heard the word countless times, yet had so few proofs that it was real. Her parents' marriage had been one of duty and politics, as was her aunt's. At the royal court, young noblewomen were courted by brave knights and warriors, yet in Alexandra's eyes, their admiration was nothing more than blind fascination, fantasies of the mind rarely touched by reality. Still, she did not lose hope. Somewhere, there had to exist someone who would be her mirror, who would understand and accept her fully, who would walk beside her as an equal, bound by fate into a single unity. But every flicker of hope in her heart was swiftly extinguished by the bitter truths of the world she was born into. A world where feelings mattered little, and only power, influence, public image, and material wealth held weight. At 20, she had to relinquish her dream of the ideal partner, when her parents revealed the choice they had made for her. She was to marry the son of the wealthiest man in the kingdom, Lord Timon of House Prano, heir to the vast holdings of Sagrant, master of gold mines and precious gemstones. Timon was 9 years her senior, a striking man renowned across Drayan for his strategy, courage in battle, and noble heart. Many admired him, and in the eyes of the court, he was the perfect match. Yet one fatal truth shadowed the arrangement. Lord Tamon's heart had long been claimed by none other than her own sister, Milieth. The two had met at a tournament in their youth, and from that moment, Tamon had been hopelessly devoted to her. He had once fought for her honor against the Prince of Gelior, and had sought her hand more than once, but fate and politics had intervened. When Drayan clashed with neighboring Cordell over the crossing known as the Bridge of Atonement, King Roman, renowned as one of Drayan's most peaceful rulers, had swiftly found a solution. He married Milieth to the Cordellian nobleman Count Ferenzo to secure the fragile peace, leaving Tamon with Alexandra, the sister he could never love. Tamon never truly learned to care for Alexandra, nor could he. His devotion remained fixed upon Milieth, and in his presence, Alexandra often felt a distance she could neither bridge nor ignore, yet she was not one to surrender her desires to grief. She filled the void with her own choices, companions of her own making, men who admired her wit, her fire, her presence, near and far, within the court and beyond the borders of Drayan and Tamon, aware of it all, said nothing, as if silently conceding that he could not give her what she truly sought, and perhaps respecting the freedom she refused to relinquish. Thus, Alexandra navigated the labyrinth of courtly life, admired, desired, and never truly possessed. She learned to seize what she could from the world, even if it was not love in its purest form. "Why would I lie?" Canar asked, rising from the bed and draping the blanket over his shoulders. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet challenge that matched the firelight dancing in his eyes. Alexandra did not answer immediately. She adjusted her robe, her gaze flicking to the shadows cast by the hearth. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the chamber, the tension between them was a storm. All its own Canar moved to the table where the wine waited, pouring 2 goblets with steady hands. He carried one to Alexandra, who remained seated by the mirror, and held it out to her. She turned, taking the goblet from his hand, her gray eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Because men always do this," Alexandra said, her tone lightly laced with irony. "You feed us sweet little lies that fall on our ears like honey. But it is not the heart that drives these words, only the unending desire to gain, to seize something for yourself." Canar's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile, but his eyes remained steady. The firelight flickered across his features, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the tension between them. Canar was one of those who had fallen under Alexandra's spell. The man was a wealthy merchant from Travia, the largest of the 4 great realms. For years he had been a close friend and trading partner of Lord Taman, often visiting Nomberg to deliver rare goods or negotiate new terms of alliance. His caravans were known across the mountains for their opulence: silks that shimmered like water under moonlight, spices that perfumed the air for days, and gemstones mined from the deepest roots of the world. The woman had first met him during the Festival of 5 Stars, an event held in Stern, which she attended alongside her husband. From the very moment he saw her, the Travian merchant had been captivated. There was something in her presence, the way she moved, the cool confidence in her eyes, that drew him in with irresistible force. What began as polite conversation beneath lantern-lit balconies soon turned into something far more intimate. 4 years had passed since that night, yet Canar had never stopped being her most devoted admirer and her most generous lover. He showered her with gifts: gowns of the finest Travian weave, gold jewelry that caught the firelight like liquid sunlight, rare perfumes imported from the Orange Isles, and countless other treasures he believed worthy of her. Alexandra, though she did not love him, not truly, not as she once dreamed she could love, enjoyed his company. Canar reminded her what it meant to be desired. His hands, large and warm, knew her body as if it were crafted for his touch. His words were soft, indulgent, filled with reverence. In his arms she found what her marriage had long denied her: intimacy, conversation, admiration, the illusion of closeness that almost felt real. Canar held the goblet in one hand, and with the other he brushed his fingers gently through her hair. "A lie about my feelings for you is the worst thing you could ever accuse me of," he said softly, his voice low and filled with warmth. His dark eyes met hers, steady and burning. "Alexandra, come with me. Sail away with me to Travia. You could live in my marble palace by the lake, a place where the air smells of summer and the walls shine with gold. You would want for nothing. You could have everything." Alexandra let out a quiet breath, her lips curving into a faint, ironic smile. "I'm sorry, Canar, but I have no desire to share you with 3 wives and a handful of lovers." "I told you," he said quickly, a trace of pleading in his tone. "I have no lovers but you, and none of my wives could ever compare to you, Alexandra." There was truth in his voice, or at least the kind of truth that lovers tell themselves when they wish to believe she rose from her chair and stood before him. The difference between them was striking. He, tall and broad as a mountain bear; she, slender and graceful, like a deer standing in the snow. "Canar," she said quietly, "I already have a husband. It is by his side I am meant to remain. Besides, I am content here, where I am." "Here?" He gestured toward the frost-glazed window. "In this land of endless winter and silence. You could die of boredom here. You've never seen Travia, have you? You cannot imagine its beauty, the warmth, the color, the life. And why cling to loyalty for a man who does not even see you? A man whose heart belongs to another? With me, you would be my whole world." His voice lowered to a whisper as he placed his large hands on her waist, pulling her closer. "Canar, please," she murmured, her tone softer now, almost weary. "Don't drag me into another dream. I've already lived through too many of those, and every one of them ended the same way, with disappointment." Her eyes met his, full of quiet resignation, the look of someone who had long stopped believing that love could save her. A sudden knock broke the stillness. The lovers stepped back from each other, the air between them still heavy with what had just passed. "My lady, word has arrived. Your husband approaches the city gates," came the muffled voice of Didi, Alexandra's young handmaid. "Very well, Didi," Alexandra called out, her tone calm and composed. "Have the servants set the table and prepare a bath with hot water. The lord will be hungry and weary after his journey." "Yes, my lady," the girl replied, and moments later the hurried sound of her footsteps faded down the stone corridor. Alexandra turned toward Kanar, her expression now cool and distant, as if a veil had fallen over her features. "That will be enough for tonight, Kanar. Once Taman arrives, it's best he doesn't find us together. I have no wish to provoke him unnecessarily." The man sighed and drained the last of his wine before setting the goblet down. "I could never have enough of you," he said quietly. "But you're right. Taman has had a long mission. Best not to trouble him further." Alexandra walked to the wardrobe, pulling out a gown of deep crimson silk. The firelight caught on the fabric, sending faint ripples of gold across her skin. Kanar's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as though trying to memorize her, before duty reclaimed her. Outside, the storm still howled against the castle walls, a low, unending roar that echoed the unrest neither of them dared to speak aloud. Alexandra, now dressed with perfect grace, waited in the entrance hall, flanked by several servants. Her gown of deep green silk shimmered faintly in the glow of the torches, her hair swept up with deliberate precision. When the great doors opened, a rush of cold air swept through the corridor. Taman appeared on the threshold, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, his clothes and dark hair dusted with snow. His cheeks were reddened by the wind, a thin layer of frost glimmering on his lashes. 2 young attendants hurried forward to relieve him of the cloak, shaking the snow from its edges. Taman's eyes found hers, calm, unreadable, distant. He approached her, inclining his head slightly before brushing his lips against her cheek. "Alexandra," he greeted quietly. "Taman," she replied in the same composed tone, returning the courtesy with a faint kiss upon his cheek. "I'm glad you returned safely," she continued, her voice soft but formal. "A hot bath has been prepared for you, and the cooks have roasted a fresh duck. You must be hungry after your journey." "Luckily, the gods watched over me and my men," he said simply, his voice even and restrained. For a heartbeat, silence lingered between them, not the kind born of comfort, but of all the words that had never been spoken. The servants bowed and withdrew, leaving husband and wife standing in the vast hall, surrounded by the whisper of the wind sneaking in through the cracks of the old doors. "Allow me to walk you to your chambers," Alexandra said softly, slipping her arm through his. Together they moved slowly down the dim, cold corridor. The torches along the walls flickered weakly, their light catching in the frost that crept along the stones. "You smell of Travian oils," Taman said after a moment, leaning closer to her hair. "Has Kanar been visiting us again?" "He's still here," Alexandra replied calmly, "waiting for you in the dining hall. He said he has a new offer for you, something he called particularly advantageous." Taman gave a quiet hum of approval. He knew, as she did, what those words truly meant. Their unspoken arrangement hung between them like an old tapestry, worn, colorless, but still intact. Alexandra felt no guilt anymore. There was nothing left to betray. "It will be good to see my old friend again," Taman said. "Though I must admit, after 2 months in the company of men, I long far more for the warmth of a woman's body than for another round of trade negotiations or other men company." They stopped walking. His words struck her like a blade, not because of desire, but because of what they implied. Though there was no love between them, she was still his wife, and as such, her duty was clear. They had lain together before, rarely and without tenderness. No closeness, no affection, only the act itself, mechanical and hollow. Each time, the warrior within her wanted to resist, to deny the man who still belonged to her sister in heart, if not in name. Yet each time, duty smothered defiance, and she yielded as custom demanded. "Of course, my husband," Alexandra said quietly, her voice steady but distant. "I'll be waiting in my chambers. Come to me when you are done with Kanar." She inclined her head gracefully, her gray eyes meeting his for a brief moment, unreadable, composed, and proud. Then she turned and walked away down the corridor, her steps echoing softly against the stone. Behind her, Taman stood in silence, watching until her figure disappeared into the shadows. The cold draft swept through the hall again, carrying with it the faint scent of Travian oil and something else, something that might once have been love, had it ever been given the chance to live. Taman entered the dining hall, now dressed in clean garments of dark wool and leather. The warmth of the fire greeted him, along with the rich scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. At the long oak table sat Canar, the Travian merchant, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The moment he saw Taman, he rose to his feet, spreading his arms with a broad grin. "Taman, old friend, by the gods, it's good to see you again," he exclaimed, pulling him into a firm embrace. "Canar, you Travian lion," Taman replied with a faint smile, clapping him on the back. "Every time I see you, you've somehow grown larger. What do they feed you in that golden kingdom of yours?" Both men laughed and soon took their seats. Servants moved briskly around them. One poured wine, another carved the meat, while a young boy brought in freshly baked bread, still steaming from the oven. After a moment, Taman raised a hand, dismissing them with a gesture. "That will be all," he said. The servants bowed and slipped quietly from the room, leaving the two men alone with the soft crackle of the fire and the muffled roar of the snowstorm outside. "You must try this wine," Canar said, lifting his goblet. "A rare vintage, grown only in the southern slopes of Travia. I brought you a few casks as a gift." "You spoil us, Canar," Taman replied, taking a generous sip, the deep, warm flavor spread through him like a slow ember. "Truth be told, this wine is one of the few pleasures left to us here in Naumburg. The cold bites harder each year, and conversation grows as dull as the stones in these walls." Canar chuckled softly, swirling the wine in his goblet. "Then perhaps I should make it my duty to visit you more often, to keep both your cellar and your spirits full." "Do that," Taman said, a trace of irony in his tone. "Gods know this place could use a little more warmth, and not just from the fire." Naumburg was a small mountain town nestled at the foot of the Silver Mountains, far in the northern reaches of Drayan. Surrounded not only by jagged cliffs, but also by dense evergreen forests, it stood like a stone guardian amidst the cold, isolated, quiet, and endlessly watchful. Its location made it a place of great strategic value, a fortress city meant to stand as the northern bulwark of the realm. Taman and Alexandra had not come to this frozen edge of the world by choice. King Roman had named his son-in-law the unofficial Warden of the North, entrusting him with the protection of the kingdom's borders. Drayan was the only kingdom in the lands that had never been conquered or taken by hostile forces, yet the royal family took no chances. Should an enemy army ever descend from the mountains, Naumburg would be the first to meet them, a citadel meant to endure, to outlast any siege. The city was encircled by towering stone walls, its fortress built around a cluster of narrow towers that pierced the gray sky like silent sentinels. From their peaks, one could see miles of wilderness, snow and pine stretching as far as the eye could reach. Taman and Alexandra had lived here for 10 years, long enough to grow accustomed to the rhythm of this cold and distant place. For Alexandra, Naumburg had become both a prison and a refuge. Though stripped of the luxuries of the royal court, she found in its solitude a strange sense of peace. The howling winds had become her lullaby, the snow her silent companion. And though both she and Taman had long ceased to dream of a different fate, they endured, as all those born in the north must. Naumburg was indeed an exceptionally dull, grim, and dreary town. Winter reigned here year-round, sometimes mild, sometimes brutally harsh, as it was now. Within the town itself, there was only a single tavern where the locals spent cold evenings with a mug of ale and idle chatter. Travelers from distant lands appeared rarely, but the tavern offered them a warm bed for the night. Inside the castle, Alexandra, her husband, and the other residents often gathered in the great hall during the evenings. The largest hearth in the fortress could warm the entire room, and its crackling fire was often the only truly alive thing within the cold stone walls. Here, by the Lord's command, the bard played his lute, filling the hall with songs of heroic deeds and brave warriors, as well as tender love ballads. The children of the servants played with wooden toys, their laughter mingling with the music. Alexandra spent her time embroidering with Didi and the other women of the castle, while Tamon typically challenged one of his most trusted men to a game of chess. It was in this hall that one could hear news from beyond the town, even from other parts of the kingdom. Here, the stone walls were warmed not just by fire, but by laughter, dancing, and the quiet joys of life, the fleeting pleasures that made even Nomberg bearable. Tell me, Tamon, how was your journey to those distant, God-forsaken islands? Kanar asked, breaking the brief silence. I think I must put an end to these expeditions, Tamon replied with a weary sigh. They will be the death of me. That fool Bollard, who rules Sheep Island, decided he would not pay tribute to the council until they helped him eliminate his brother. He imagined that Ildren wanted to kill him and seize power, all because he himself had taken Ildren's wife and brought her to his halls. As always, it's about a woman, Kanar commented with dry irony. And did you fulfill his request? The merchant asked. Not at all, Tamon said, taking another sip of wine, letting it spill slightly over his chin, which he wiped with the back of his hand. I made it clear to him, in my own way, that the council is not at anyone's beck and call, and that it is no charitable institution. If he wishes for the council's armies to protect him, he must pay, just like everyone else. I solved it differently, Tamon continued. I brought his brother to the capital, forced Bollard to return his wife, and made Ildren sign an agreement that he would neither claim his brother's power nor plot against his life. Another mission accomplished then. Congratulations, Kanar said, raising his goblet. But on the way to those islands, I saw horrors, Kanar. On one of the neighboring isles, which the council took under its protection last year, I witnessed unspeakable cruelty. The locals are non-believers, and the council has deemed it their sacred duty to convert them. I saw rape, children murdered in front of their mothers, mass graves, and people burned alive. It should never be like this. Tamon's voice grew heavy, his expression darkening, as if the terrible scenes played out before his eyes once more. I warned you, my friend, Kanar said gravely. The council is no place for men like you. Men with noble hearts and true concern for the people, they have long lost any notion of morality. Those monsters in Morris survive by preying on others, enriching themselves on the suffering of the innocent, and using people like puppets, like they use you, sending you endlessly on their errands. And what do you gain from it? Status in the council? Reputation? To hell with a reputation that is stained with blood. I suppose I was blind, Kanar, when I signed on, Tamon admitted quietly, staring into his wine. But I have resolved to change that. I will stand for the office of the Supreme Father. Only he wields real power in Morris and over the council. If I become him, I will reform the council's policies and forbid any further conquests or conversion of the unbelievers. The candidate list will open soon. I will submit my name. You've gone mad, Tamon. You intend to lead those monsters in the council? Don't fool yourself. It won't change a thing. True reform requires a new order. As long as the council in Morris exists, it is impossible. And do you know who you would have to compete against? I've heard that the best commanders and wealthiest politicians from all corners of the New Lands will be standing. Rumor has it even Gideon plans to put forward one of his sons, Prince Leon, as a candidate. It makes perfect sense that Gelior is trying to seize that position, Tamon said, his voice steady but laced with concern. After all, no Geliorian has held the office of Supreme Father in over 100 years. And the last one who did, Gidri the Reckless, nearly plunged the Great Four into open war. I don't intend to see history repeat itself. Gideon is known not only for his conquests, but for ambitions that know no bounds. He'll do anything to see his bloodline rise above all others. That's why I'm very serious of these elections." Taman paused, his gaze drifting toward the frost-coated window. "Thank the gods," he added quietly, "that he's promoting his second son. Who knows what would happen if his eldest were the one pursuing the title?" Kanar gave a short, humorless laugh and shook his head. "Don't even speak of it. That mad bear prince would have set the whole continent ablaze if he ever won the election. And yet, for all his madness, people loved him. The common folk in Gelior adored him, and the power brokers in Morris admired him for being everything his father was not." "Was?" Taman asked, arching an eyebrow. "You haven't heard, my friend?" Kanar leaned closer, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret best left unspoken. "A few months ago, Gedeon sent his wayward son to the eastern frontier, to the highlands, to crush a rebellion that had been festering there for years. Rolling hills, dry winds, scattered villages. Not a place for princes, but for men who've already been forgotten. Since then, not a whispers has returned. Some say he's still out there, wandering among the hills and ruins. Others think he's dead, buried beneath the dust." He took a slow sip of wine before continuing, a smirk touching his lips. Whatever the truth, Gideon rid himself of a lunatic who terrified half his court. Perhaps the high lands did for him what no courtly council could. Silenced him for good. The Bear Prince, as he would later be called, brought upon his royal bloodline a shadow that Gelior would never forget. Prince Hadrian, firstborn of King Gedeon and Lady Hannah, had been raised from birth as the heir to the throne, a young warrior destined to inherit his father's crown. But fate, and something far darker, had other plans for him. It all began with the Wild Hunt, a rite that shaped every Geliorian boy's passage into manhood. For as long as memory reached, the people of Gelior had been a nation of conquerors and raiders, their identity forged in steel and blood. Even those of humble birth were taught the ways of combat in small martial schools scattered across the kingdom. But lessons alone meant little. The true test came with the hunt. The Geliorians, born of many ancient tribes that once inhabited the island, followed a faith somewhere between polytheism and animism. They worshipped countless deities of nature, most of them manifested through the forms of animals. Each warrior was believed to be bound to a sacred creature, his patron spirit, a living reflection of the god who guided his fate. When a boy turned 15, he would be sent into the forest near his home, armed with nothing but a crude weapon, an axe, a hunting spear, a sling, or a knife of chipped stone, to slay one of the wild beasts that roamed within. If he returned victorious, the animal would become his totem. Its claws, teeth, or bones would be made into an amulet worn around his neck, symbolizing the divine bond between hunter and god. Among the royal family, this tradition carried an even greater weight. Their trophies defined their titles. King Gedeon himself bore the name Wolfbane, earned when he slew a silver-furred dire wolf during his youth. His father, Baudrian IV, was once known as the Terror of Stags. So when 15-year-old Hadrian set out into the whistling forest, west of the capital, to earn his own name, his father expected nothing less than greatness. At first, all went as it always had. The other boys returned within a few days, bloodied and proud, dragging foxes, boars, and wolves behind them. But Hadrian did not come back. Days turned into weeks. Gideon and Lady Hannah prayed and sacrificed to their gods, begging for a sign, but none came. After 2 weeks, the court declared the young prince dead. Then, one mist-shrouded morning, a farmer passing near the forest saw a boy emerge from the trees. His clothes were torn, his body thin and pale, yet his eyes burned with a strange light. Behind him he dragged the lifeless body of a black bear. The black bears of Gelior were legends in their own right, creatures of nightmare that stalked the woods, slaughtering anyone foolish enough to cross their path. Only once in Geliorian history had a man returned from the wild hunt with a slain black bear. Calian II the Conqueror, Gideon's own grandfather. So when Hadrian returned alive, bearing such a trophy, the kingdom rejoiced. Gideon held a feast lasting 3 days and 3 nights. He named his son the Devourer of Bare Hearts, for it was said the boy had killed the beast by cutting out its heart with his own hands. But the glory did not last. Within a week of his return, the prince began to change. He discarded his royal garments for black robes, though the color of the royal house was deep blue. He painted his lips and eyes with soot and ink, and had strange symbols tattooed across his face. From the hide of the slain bear, he crafted a cloak that he wore constantly, calling it his second skin. His once neat hair grew long and wild until it reached his waist. When asked about his time in the forest, Hadrian would speak of strange things. He claimed that the forest itself had aided him in the hunt, that it had whispered to him, guided him. He said he had not eaten for days, living only on the leaves of the ash trees, and that when he was thirsty, the gods sent him brief, gentle rains to drink from his palms. At night, when cold winds swept through the woods, he slept surrounded by foxes and wild dogs that came to warm him with their fur. King Gideon and Lady Hannah feared their son had gone mad, his mind shattered by solitude and terror. They summoned shamans to cleanse him through ancient rites, but nothing worked. If anything, the prince grew stranger. At 17, he began to vanish for days into the forests near the capital, performing rituals he described as offerings to the spirits, prayers of thanks to the forest that had saved him. When he returned, he carried small dead creatures, hares, squirrels, forest mice, which he used to brew elixirs that he drank in place of wine. The palace whispered of madness. The city murmured of curses. The boy once hailed as Gelior's next great conqueror became instead its haunting myth. Children fled at the sight of him. Adults averted their gaze. His pale face, black markings, and emerald eyes earned him a fearful reverence. A man who looked too close to death itself. And yet, despite his eerie manner, Hadrian was gentle by nature. In Maurus and beyond the borders of Gelior, he was known as the opposite of his father. He despised politics, avoided violence, and spoke often of peace. Even the animals he hunted, he said, were necessary sacrifices, taken only when the forest permitted. Those who knew him whispered that he took after his mother, calm, kind, unambitious. He was also strikingly beautiful. From his father, he inherited thick black hair, strong brows, and the proud build of a warrior. From his mother, he took large light green eyes, a straight, noble nose, and a smile that seemed too pure for his bloodline. Lord Tamon leaned back in his chair, lost for a moment in memory. He remembered the way Alexandra had once spoken of Bear Prince, not to his face, but when she thought he wasn't listening. It had been after a royal gathering in Maurus, amid candlelight and laughter. If the almighty Ross himself descended from the heavens and took human form, she had said to her cousin, he would look like him. The echo of her voice faded, replaced by the rustle of Canar's silk sleeves as the merchant shifted in his seat. Tamon blinked, drawn back to the present. Canar was watching him with that knowing half-smile. "You've gone quiet again, old friend," he said lightly, before his tone grew more deliberate. "Anyway, as we were saying about Gelior and its lunatic prince, if I were you, I'd stay far away from all this. The council, the elections, the power plays. None of it ends well for men who still have something to lose. Best not to get caught up before the darkness of international politics swallows you too." Lord exhaled through his nose, the hint of a smile ghosting across his face. "Perhaps you're right." "Again," he admitted. "But enough about me. Tell me instead, how fares your business these days?" The merchant groaned softly, leaning back in his chair. "Not well, to be honest. Have you heard about what's happening in Cordell?" Tamon tilted his head. "You mean the 16-year-old prince who overthrew his own mother, the queen, and declared himself the new ruler?" "That's the one," Canar said, his voice rising with disbelief. "Can you imagine? Madness, I had half a dozen trade partners in Cordell and the surrounding islands. Queen Marlena was a blessing to merchants. Fair tariffs, open ports, and taxes so low they were almost symbolic. He waved his hands animatedly, frustration clear in every motion. Now, with this boy king on the throne, everything's uncertain. The winds are changing, Taman, and not in our favor. Rumor has it, the young ruler wants to promote local craftsmanship and self-reliance, which, in plain words, means heavier import duties and fewer foreign traders. If that happens, the market will collapse before winter's end. Taman watched his friend quietly for a moment, the firelight flickering across his thoughtful expression. He knew Kanar well enough to recognize the difference between a complaint and a genuine worry, and this was clearly the latter. There is also another thing you probably don't know yet, but I've been trying to change paths for the past few months. I've grown tired of trade and haggling. I want something else, something more interesting, more alive. Let me guess, you want to leave all your gold behind and join a troupe of street performers? Taman said with a laugh. That's one way to do it, perhaps in the next life. Kanar replied with a grin. No, I mean travel. Travel? Haven't you had enough of it? You're practically always on the road, Taman said, raising an eyebrow. Not that kind of travel, my friend. I mean sea voyages beyond the world we know. Exploring new lands, new waters, perhaps even encountering other civilizations, Kanar said, his face alight with excitement, his voice trembling with anticipation. Taman looked at his companion across the table with a hint of amusement. Voyages beyond the world we know? Well, my friend, it seems we both have our mad ideas, he said, smiling and patting Kanar on the shoulder. And we are both seriously committed, Kanar added, returning the smile. So, where do you plan to sail, Kanar? Taman asked. I intend to head east, Kanar replied. East? Of all possible directions, you choose the most dangerous. You know you cannot conquer the screaming waters. Many have tried, but none returned alive, Taman cautioned. Perhaps on ordinary ships, yes. But remember, during our last meeting, you introduced me to that lord from Rambertia. He is said to build the sturdiest vessels, Kanar said confidently. You mean Palric? Indeed. His ships are considered among the best in the new lands. But any such vessel will cost you a fortune, Taman replied. I am aware. But you know as well as I do that I lack for nothing financially. Beyond the ships, I've also been thinking about men. I'll need a few dozen hardy soldiers. That's why I'm here. I know your Drayanians are renowned for their endurance and toughness, Kanar explained. This is the offer Alexandra mentioned? You want my men? Taman asked, raising an eyebrow. Has she told you yet? Yes, I want us to form a partnership. They don't have to be your men, but you'll find me a few dozen of them, and I'll make sure you get plenty of support votes in the elections, at least among the Travian Council members. What do you say? My original plan was to offer you a new batch of pink quartz every third moon, but now, I see I have something far better to propose, Kanar said, grinning like a true merchant bargaining for the best deal. Well, I must say that offer is tempting. When would you need these men? Taman asked. Tomorrow I set off for Rambertia. It's time I explored more of your kingdom than just this cursed northern land of snow and storms. I'll be staying with Palric, probably for a few moons, to see the construction of those ships in progress. And of course, to enjoy myself a bit and take a break from my duties, I hear hundreds will gather soon for your famous ice tournament there, Kanar replied with a grin. Oh yeah, that one is a real show. You must see it at least once in your life. Believe me, you won't be bored in Rambertia. So you're giving me a few moons to find these men? Seems doable. I think I can manage, Taman said. For heaven's sake, Taman. I didn't expect you to agree so quickly. But once again, you prove that doing business with you is pure pleasure, Kanar said, raising his cup. Then let us drink to us and our mad ideas, he announced, toasting. And to our naive faith in a better life, Taman added. They clinked their goblets and drained them to the last drop. Meanwhile, Alexandra waited in her chamber, dressed in a nightgown, lying on the bed with a book in her hands. Didi moved quietly around the room, ensuring the fire in the hearth burned brightly enough to warm her mistress, and preparing her outfit for the following day. Didi, I plan to go into town tomorrow, to the market, to do some shopping. Would you like to accompany me? Alexandra asked. You needn't ask, my lady. Just tell me, and I will, the girl replied softly, her blonde hair falling to her shoulders. I've told you, Didi. Your will matters to me. You are no longer a slave, but my right hand, Alexandra said, setting her book aside. And your handmaiden, my lady, Didi added. That too. But that doesn't mean I will force you to do everything. This is your home as much as mine, and to me, you are like family. And in a family, every member has a voice. Everyone has the right to speak, Alexandra explained. You are too kind, my lady. Someone of your position shouldn't care for someone like me, Didi said, hanging the navy blue dress on the chair that Alexandra was to wear tomorrow. But I do care, the princess said firmly. She spoke the truth. Alexandra cared for Didi more than for almost anyone else close to her. With the young, 15-year-old handmaiden, she shared a bond unlike any other. She had met Didi at one of the markets on the colorful isles during her journey to the Azure Island. Those islands bore a dark reputation in the new lands, all because of the trade in humans. It was at one of these black markets that she saw a very young, starving, and emaciated girl. Didi belonged to a merchant who treated his goods with particular cruelty. Like the other slaves, Didi's body was marked with bruises, scratches, and scars. Alexandra had been about to pass by, but their eyes met by chance, and in the girl's pale blue gaze, she saw a silent plea for help. It was as if her eyes were begging the princess to pull her out of that hell. Recalling her own youth and the carefree childhood she had enjoyed in the royal castle, Alexandra could not bear the injustice of another's suffering. She felt an urgent need not only to rescue the girl, but also to ease her own conscience, which had begun to weigh heavily upon her. She gave almost all the money she had with her to redeem Didi and brought her back to Drayan, here, to Naumburg. At first the girl was so withdrawn, scarred by everything she had endured, that she could hardly speak. Only after several moons did Alexandra manage to coax her name from the girl. Didi. It remained uncertain whether this was her true name or one given by her cruel master, a symbol of her enslavement. Yet when she finally began to open up, she insisted that she wanted to be called that. Here in Naumburg, she was treated differently. Like the other servants, she had her own small room. She received payment for her work in the castle, and no one ever raised a hand against her. Alexandra considered herself a fair mistress, and strove to prove it to her subjects. Yet it was Didi for whom she felt the deepest attachment and fondest affection. However, even Alexandra herself didn't truly know who the girl was, where she came from, how she had fallen into the hands of a slave trader, or whether she had any family at all. One thing, however, she knew for certain. Didi's birthplace did not belong to any of the kingdoms of the Great Four. She spoke with a strange accent, unlike any tongue Alexandra had ever heard. And when they returned to Naumburg, Alexandra sometimes heard her speak in her sleep, murmuring in an unknown language, one that even the princess, educated in many of the world's dialects, could not recognize once. Alexandra invited her to pray together in the chapel of the High Ross, but the girl refused, saying that where she came from, her people did not worship gods at all. The residents of the castle often speculated about which of the islands she might have come from, yet to this day her origin remains a mystery. When Alexandra was finally left alone in her chamber, Tamon appeared after a short while. He was slightly drunk and looked tired. There was something strange about the way he moved. Before entering the room, he glanced down the corridor to make sure no one was there. Then he closed the door behind him and locked it, something he had never done before. Instead of coming to her, he went from window to window, shutting the wooden shutters one by one. The princess watched him carefully, trying to understand what was happening. I didn't know our marital duty had become such a grand secret, she said, rising from the bed. She let her nightgown fall to the floor and approached her husband, naked. But to her surprise, Tamon did not undress. Instead, he looked at her and spoke in a low, almost whispering voice. Alexandra, Put your clothes back on. That's not why I'm here tonight. She frowned. Have you been drinking too much, my lord? Alexandra, you need to dress and focus. I have something to tell you, something very important. The princess rolled her eyes, but did as he asked, pulling the nightgown over her shoulders again. Sit down, Taman said, motioning to the bed. She obeyed, and a moment later he sat beside her. Taman, you're frightening me, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out a tightly rolled piece of parchment. What is that? She asked. During my last mission, he began, I had a second task, one no one but I knew about. Besides the negotiations on Sheep Island, the council ordered me to find something important to them. They sent me to the Dead Isles. The Dead Isles? Alexandra's tone grew sharp. There's nothing there. No one lives on those cursed rocks. They're surrounded by dark legends. Some say those who return from them lose their minds within days. I thought the same, Taman said grimly, but I was wrong. After 2 weeks of wandering through barren plains and frozen marshes, 2 of my men stumbled upon something. Ruins. A temple, or perhaps a palace. The walls were carved with strange symbols and writings in a language none of us knew. In the center, we found the remains of what must have been a tomb. We broke through the stone and found a skeleton, ancient, reduced to dust and bone. And in its hand, it held this. He handed her the rolled parchment. Alexandra's eyes widened as she unrolled it carefully. A long text was written on it, again in an unknown tongue. Yet the parchment itself and the ink upon it looked untouched by time, as if written only yesterday. How is that even possible? She whispered. The council sent me to find the 7th legacy, Taman said at last. His wife froze. The 7th legacy? She whispered, the weight of those words heavy in the air. That's just a myth. Everyone in the new lands knows it doesn't exist. I thought so too, he said, until the council asked me to find it. Why would they command me to seek something that isn't real? I spoke privately with the High Father himself. He told me the council had been searching for it for centuries, almost since their founding. His words still echo in my mind. Taman, it is the key to humanity's past and its future. Woman's voice trembled. Do you believe this parchment is the legacy? I do, Taman admitted, but I never told the council. I lied. I told them I found nothing on those damned Dead Isles. His voice broke slightly, heavy with guilt, and something that almost sounded like fear. Alexandra remembered the story she had been taught as a child, the only one known to the world, written in the Meressian Chronicles, called The Tale of the 6 Legacies. It spoke of a time long, long ago, before the Great Migration, when there existed a vast and mighty empire known as Largos. It was a civilization unmatched in its glory. Masters of warfare and strategy, builders of monumental stone cities whose towers touched the heavens, and fearless sailors who ruled the seas with ships of white sails and golden hulls. For over 1,000 years, it was ruled by the dynasty of the Embards. In those days, the word magic was unknown to humankind. The people believed only in the gods, the Great Five, Ignis, goddess of healing, beauty, and abundance, Omanier, god of joy, dance, wine, and sensual pleasures, Caden, god of war, courage, and heroic valor, Veera, goddess of wealth, success, and fortune, and above them all, Ros, the supreme and most powerful of them, god of wisdom, knowledge, justice, and virtue. Every strange event, every miracle and calamity alike, was seen as divine intervention. Across the empire, there existed many mysterious and sacred places filled with unexplainable phenomena. One of them was the Silent Forest, a dark, eerie woodland stretching for miles north of the capital, Celerium. The people feared it deeply and avoided its borders. It was said to be a place one could enter, but never return from. Those who had ventured into its depths vanished forever. Countless legends surrounded the forest, yet no one truly knew what lay within. The tale begins in the year 44 before the Great Migration. At that time, the throne of Largos was held by the wise and noble King Alwyn IV, called the Serene, and his beloved wife, Queen Loalia. Their marriage was strong, bound by love and mutual respect, yet fate had denied them an heir. Despite years of prayer and countless attempts, Loalia remained barren. One day, word reached the king's court of a mysterious young woman in a northern village, a woman said to perform miracles, healing the sick, calling rain upon the farmers' dry fields, moving objects with nothing but her gaze. Intrigued and desperate for answers, the king and queen sent their soldiers to bring her to the royal capital. When the woman was brought to the solarium, she was declared an honored and exceptional guest of the royal family, and was invited to reside within the royal palace itself. There, before the very eyes of King Alwyn and Queen Loalia, she performed wonders the likes of which neither of them could believe. She claimed her name was Saga, and that her miracles were no divine blessings, for she was not human at all. It was then, for the first time in recorded history, that the word magic was spoken. Saga explained that she had come from the silent forest, and that she was a Baliarxian, a being of another race, far older and far more advanced than humankind, gifted with powers beyond mortal comprehension. The forest, she said, was not merely a cursed wood, but a gateway, a passage between the world of men and that of her people, Baliar. That, she revealed, was why no human ever returned from it. No one whose blood was not touched by Baliar essence could pass through and live by order of King Alwyn. Every word she spoke was carefully recorded by the royal scribes. Saga taught them that the Baliar were not a single kind, but divided into distinct orders, according to the nature of the power they practiced. The moon callers drew their strength from the moon. Their magic lived and breathed only under the night sky, reaching its peak beneath the full moon's silver glow. The sun-forged found their power in the sun itself, radiant and formidable by day, yet weakened and nearly powerless once darkness fell. The forest binders were those whose strength was bound to nature, to trees, leaves, and all living green. Where there was no life, no grass, nor moss, nor branch, their magic faded, and they were rendered helpless. And then there were the eclipse-born, the rarest and most powerful of all. They were those born beneath the shadow of an eclipse, whether solar or lunar. In them flowed the might of both sun and moon. Between eclipses they gathered their strength, waiting in silence until the heavens aligned once more. When that moment came, their power became unstoppable, capable of shaping worlds, and unmatched by any other force known to man or god. Saga claimed that she herself belonged to the sun-forged, and that beneath the light of day she could heal the sick, summon rain upon barren lands, move objects with her gaze, command beasts, and bend the elements to her will. Yet when night fell, her magic faded, her power waned like the dying embers of a fire. In the year 42 before the Great Migration, tragedy struck the empire. Queen Loalia, beloved across every corner of Largos, perished while giving birth. Much like her child King Alwyn, stricken with grief, declared a time of national mourning. The one who offered him solace was none other than Saga herself. The king and the Baliar woman grew close, bound by sorrow and wonder, and soon love blossomed between them. When Alwyn spoke of marriage, Saga hesitated. She told him that before such a union could take place, she would need the blessing of the Baliar elders, the rulers of her world. Only with their consent could the blood of their two races be joined. She then departed into the silent forest, vanishing among the shadowed trees for 3 long days. When she returned, her eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. She told Alwyn that she had received their permission, and that the Baliar wished in time to make contact with humankind. But first, she said, a foundation must be laid. Humans must be prepared to accept what they had long denied, the existence of magic. She declared herself to be their messenger, the one who would first reveal the truth and bring forth a new kind of being. Children born of both worlds, in whose veins would flow not only human blood, but also the essence of Boliar. In the year 41, the king and Saraya were wed. A few moons later, their first child was born, a boy named Oliver years past, and 2 more sons followed, Dargant and Simon. From their earliest days, each boy displayed signs of the power that ran through their mother's veins. Oliver, like Saraya, drew strength from the sun's brilliance. Dargant, unlike his brother, was a child of the moon, his gift awakening under the silver glow of night. Simon found joy among the castle gardens. There, surrounded by trees and flowers, nature itself seemed to obey his innocent laughter. 4 years later, a 4th child was born, a daughter named Rose, beautiful as dawn upon still waters, and graceful as the song of the first spring wind. As the years passed, however, it became clear that Rose was different. Unlike her brothers, and unlike her mother, she showed no sign of Baliar blood. No light stirred within her hands. No whisper of magic answered her call. At least, that's what everyone believed. One day, during a solar eclipse, Oliver, the eldest of the princes, witnessed something that changed everything. His 15-year-old sister bringing a dead bird back to life. He instantly knew what it meant. Remembering his mother's words, only one kind of Baliar could not only heal, but also resurrect. The Eclipse-born. Realizing that his beloved younger sister was stronger than any of them, and fearing that he and his brothers would forever live in her shadow, darkness grew in his heart. Oliver decided to get rid of her before anyone else discovered what she was. Taking advantage of the king and Queen Saraya's absence from the capital, he told his brothers what he had seen, spreading jealousy and hatred until they too turned against innocent Rose. Together, they formed a plan. One night, they sent assassins to her chambers to kill her and dispose of her body. But Rose, as if protected by a higher force, suddenly awoke in the middle of the night, hearing a voice in her head telling her to run. "They're coming for you," whispered the voice again. Trusting her instincts, she obeyed and escaped through a secret passage. When the assassins entered her room, they found it empty. Furious, Oliver dispatched dozens of the best killers to track her down. While fleeing, Rose kept hearing the mysterious voice guiding her. "Go north." The girl followed the whispers and reached a small village north of the capital, where she found shelter. But when the hunters arrived, offering gold for her capture, one of the villagers betrayed her. Rose fled once more, relentlessly pursued by merciless men and their hounds. Exhausted, battered, and starving, she finally reached a cliff above a raging river. The hunters caught up with her. The princess begged for mercy, but their hearts were made of stone. One of them drew his bow and released an arrow straight into her chest. Rose staggered backward and fell from the cliff into the river below, the water turning red with her blood. The men returned to the royal castle, eager to bring Oliver and his brothers the good news. Their sister would trouble them no more. When King Alwyn and Queen Saraya returned to the palace, Oliver told them a tragic tale. Rose had run away with a young kitchen boy named Farron, with whom she had fallen deeply in love. He claimed witnesses saw them riding off into the night. Alwyn sent hundreds of soldiers to search for them, but no trace was ever found. Unable to bear her daughter's disappearance, Saraya eventually fled the castle as well. And as legend says, she returned to the silent forest Alwyn, who had now lost the 2 most important women in his life, abdicated the throne in favor of his son, and left the capital. Broken by grief and unable to come to terms with their loss, he withdrew to a small farming isle off the eastern coast of the empire. where he spent his final years in solitude, and where he eventually died. At that point, the story in the Tale of the Six Legacies abruptly ends. The next surviving passage resumes decades later, describing events that took place in the 3rd year before the Great Migration, when Largos was ruled by Oliver, now a man with a family of his own. His wife, Queen Omania, had given him 2 sons, Enlar and Raiden. His brothers, Simon and Dargant, governed the north and the south of the empire in his name. Oliver, determined to keep both the truth about Baliar and the knowledge of magic hidden from the common people, made a pact with his brothers. The secret would remain forever within the royal bloodline. Using their inherited powers, the 3 of them waged swift and devastating wars, expanding the empire's borders farther than ever before. Then, one day, the chronicles say that messengers arrived at the royal castle bearing astonishing news of a woman who, much like Soraya once did, performed miracles in the surrounding villages and proclaimed herself a messenger from another world. Believing that his mother had returned, Oliver sent his men to bring the woman to the capital. But when she finally stood before him in the throne hall, his heart froze, for the young woman who appeared before him bore the face of his long-gone sister, Rose. Oliver, who had always believed with absolute certainty that it was impossible for his sister to still be alive, demanded to know who the woman before him was. "I am the one whose name you erased from history," she replied calmly. Then, after a moment of silence, she added, "and the one who brings justice." Oliver, now certain that it truly was Rose, ordered the guards to seize her and throw her into the dungeons. Dozens of soldiers lunged at her at once, yet none could so much as touch her. Every blow, every arrow, every attempt at attack was reflected back upon them as if struck by invisible force. "Brothers," the woman spoke, her voice echoing through the hall, "your hearts have surrendered to darkness, poisoned by the venom of your own pride. Therefore I tell you, none of you shall have any descendants, and those you already have I will take from you in retribution for your ancient sins. None of you shall rule any longer, nor will your names endure. The heavens shall mourn the tragedy you once brought upon our family, and their tears shall fall upon your lands as a mighty storm such as no living man has seen. Just as you once divided our bloodline, the earth beneath your empire shall divide and break apart. When you plotted betrayal against me, your hearts burned like fire, and so fire shall consume your empire. I will stand as the proof that truth always prevails. The one who was betrayed shall become the one who builds anew, a legacy founded not on pride, envy, selfishness, or hunger for power. I will forge a new world, one where all shall know truth, and where mankind shall live in harmony despite its divisions, guided by those of purest intent and noblest virtue, those who will lead humanity toward the light. This shall be the dawn of a new era, and the old one shall fade into dust. Mark my words, 4 years shall not pass before all that I have spoken comes to pass. You wanted legacy. These will be your legacies." When Rose finished speaking, her form shimmered, and like mist at sunrise, she dissolved into thin air, vanishing before the stunned eyes of all in the throne hall. The 6 legacies, in the form of prophecies that Rose had bestowed upon her brothers, began to unfold one by one. Barely a month had passed since her disappearance, when Oliver's eldest son, Enlar, met a tragic death on the battlefield. A few months later, a terrible plague claimed his second son, Raiden. Around the same time, Simon's daughter died in childbirth, and Dargant's son was slain in a duel during a royal tournament. Thus the first legacy was fulfilled. The brothers were stripped of the children they had, and no matter how they tried, none could sire another. Neither wives nor mistresses could grant them any heirs. When Oliver and his brothers finally understood that their sister's words were coming true, repentance filled their hearts. But it was too late across the empire. Uprisings and rebellions erupted. The people, weary of the embarred dynasty, rose to bring it down. Oliver spent his days and nights praying before the altars of the 5 gods, begging for forgiveness and mercy, but none of them heard his cries. A year later, the capital fell to the rebels. Oliver, his brothers, and the royal family fled the palace under the cover of night, like thieves escaping judgment. And so the second legacy was fulfilled. None of the brothers would rule again, and the memory of their names would fade into oblivion. Yet even under new rule, the realm found no peace. Mighty storms began to sweep across the empire, some lasting for weeks. Floods destroyed farmlands, homes, and entire towns. The people fled for safety, losing everything they had. Thus came the third legacy. The heavens began to weep. Soon after, the southern lands were struck by great earthquakes, tearing the ground apart and forcing thousands to flee. Some sought refuge deeper within the empire, others escaped to nearby islands. The fourth legate was fulfilled. The earth was split and divided. Finally, in the first year before the Great Migration, the rains ceased. In their place came a drought unlike anything Largos had ever known. For months the land burned as fires devoured entire provinces. The empire was consumed by flame, and so the fifth legacy was fulfilled, the one that would ignite the Great Migration itself. Desperate and broken, the people of Largos fled in all directions. Some went north, others east or west, but most fled south. It was then that Rose's name appeared in the chronicles once more. The woman who had once performed miracles before the eyes of common folk revealed herself again, this time to the fleeing masses. She told them she knew of a place where they could begin anew, a land where they would build their future and their home. Together with them, she boarded ships organized by King Garnor, the very man who had once overthrown her brothers. Hundreds of ships, carrying thousands of souls, sailed across vast and endless waters until they reached land, the Dead Isles, known today as the cradle of the two new lands. There, Rose, using her power of the eclipse, helped them build the first settlements and villages. Years passed, and those villages grew into cities. Rose, once the king's trusted advisor, became his wife, and the queen of a new world they were creating together. She gave him a child, a son who became the first of a new dynasty. The Leongorians, named after their son, Leongon. Yet, not long after his birth, Rose passed away, leaving no other heirs behind. The chronicles then leap 90 years forward, to the time when what had once been mere colonies had grown into a thriving kingdom. Zenareth, ruled by the descendants of Rose and Garnor. For generations, the Leongorians reigned with a blend of wisdom and ambition, expanding their dominion across the southern coasts and deep into the fertile valleys of the east. Yet, as their power grew, so too did their complacency. When King Keldrian, the left-handed, took the throne, the light of Zenareth began to fade. Seldrian had ruled for 5 years, 5 long years of stagnation and decay. The kingdom faltered under his uncertain hand. Trade dwindled, the borders weakened, and the people, once united under the Leongorian banner, became divided and bitter. Among the loudest voices of discontent were the Barlinian family, long known for their service to the royal court as advisors, chroniclers, and preachers. They saw firsthand how weak and misguided the king had become. Then came the tragedy that changed the course of Zenareth forever. While on a hunting expedition in the forests of Varnadale, King Keldrian was found dead, torn apart, they said, by wild wolves. He left behind no heir. The throne stood empty for the first time in the kingdom's history. In the chaos that followed, the Barlinian family turned to the high priest of the 5, the spiritual head of the realm, imploring him to seek divine guidance and name the one chosen by the gods. Not long after, the priest declared that the Great 5 had spoken, and their will was clear. Fandriel of House Barlinian was to be crowned the new king of Zenareth. Once the trusted counselor of the fallen monarch, Fandriel was beloved by the people, a man of faith, intellect, and vision. His coronation marked the dawn of a new era. Thus ended the reign of the Leongorian line, and thus began the rule of the Barlenians, a dynasty born not from royal blood, but from divine favor. The chronicles then leap forward again, many decades after the rise of House Barlenius, to the reign of King Martilian the Blue-Eyed, the third monarch of his line under Martilian's rule. Zenareth flourished. Cities expanded, trade routes stretched far beyond the known seas, and the kingdom basked in an age of prosperity and enlightenment. Yet with every year of growth came a new burden. The lands grew crowded, the soil tired, and the granaries began to thin. What had once been a land of abundance now faced the slow hunger of its own success. In response, the king issued a royal proclamation that would change the course of history: the Decree of Maritime Expeditions. The decree called upon explorers, scholars, and seafarers to venture beyond the horizon, to discover new lands and claim them in the name of Zenareth. He also sent the best sailors and several thousand soldiers to explore the seas. These voyages became the very beginning of what would one day be known as the New Lands, shaped across many generations into the realms Alexandra knew now. As the years turned to decades, and decades turned to centuries, 4 great kingdoms arose upon those faraway continents: Drayan, Gelior, Cordell, and Travia, each forging its own heritage, customs, and ambitions. When new lands were found, some people still chose to remain behind on the Dead Isles, where for a time independent city-states continued to exist. Yet as the decades passed, what was once the kingdom of Zenareth faded from memory, just as Largos had before it. All that remains to this day are the ruins of temples and palaces, fragments of towns and villages swallowed by the earth or overgrown with moss, silent witnesses of kingdom long gone. The Marian chronicles leap forward once more, this time to the age of the High Council's founding. Between the years 220 and 230, after the Great Migration, the 4 great kingdoms, long since independent realms, had almost entirely forgotten the shared blood and history that once united them. This period was marked by ceaseless wars and rivalries. First came the Cordelian-Travian War over the Orange Isles, which raged for several years. Then King Baudrian II, the ambitious of Gelior, began a campaign of expansion, seeking to conquer smaller realms and neighboring islands. His growing influence alarmed King Dedric, ruler of Drayan, who resisted his ambitions and raised his armies in response. Finally, between the years 228 and 230, a great conflict arose over the Purple Isle, the very land that would later become the heart and political center of the New Lands. Each kingdom declared its claim over it, and in 229 the dispute reached its climax in the Battle of the 4 Horses, fought upon the virgin plain at the island's center. It was a war unlike any other, for each monarch personally rode into battle, leading his army with sword in hand and banners raised high. By strange coincidence, each ruler mounted a horse of a different color. The king of Drayan upon a black steed, the king of Gelior upon a white, the king of Cordell upon a chestnut, and the king of Travia upon a leopard-spotted horse, whose coat resembled that of a wildcat. Thus the battle was named for them. After days of fierce and senseless bloodshed, the rulers finally saw the futility of their war. They reached an unprecedented agreement. If the island could not belong to one, it would belong to all, and to none at the same time. It was a mad idea, but it worked. The kings poured vast fortunes into the creation of an international capital, and within decades, the magnificent city of Maurus was born. A sovereign city-state, open to all kingdoms yet claimed by none there, the 4 rulers founded the High Council, an institution meant to safeguard order and peace across all nations. The council would be composed of 100 members, 25 from each of the 4 kingdoms, and would govern Maurus itself. It would possess its own treasury, its own army, and would be led by a single figure: the High Father, elected from among the council for a 7-year term. Though each kingdom remained sovereign, their rulers were now bound to respect the council's decrees and the authority of the High Father. The founding of the council marked the dawn of a new age in the New Lands, the era of peace, a time without wars or international conflict, lasting from the year 264 after the Great Migration to this very day. And thus, the 6th legacy was fulfilled. Rose's prophecy came to pass. She had indeed laid the foundation of a new world, one in which every soul knows the truth of Baliar and remembers the fate of her and her kin. A world where, despite differences, the peoples of the New Lands live in unity and harmony. A world watched over by the Council, composed of those she once called the Chosen, the ones who will lead mankind toward the light. The 7th legacy, though, was never recorded in the chronicles. It was a phenomenon that arose much later. It began in the year 333, right here in Drayan, the homeland of Alexandra, and her husband. At that time, the kingdom was ruled by King Leonard III, the Soothsayer, a monarch who had sat upon the throne for 30 years, and was widely regarded as the least devout and least God-fearing ruler in Drayan's history. During a grand tournament in which he personally took part, Leonard suffered a serious head injury. For weeks he lay bedridden, forbidding anyone but the royal physicians to enter his chamber, not even his own family. Those who did tend to him claimed that the king had grown strange. They reported that he would often speak to himself, as if another presence were in the room. Through the closed doors, servants sometimes heard voices, conversations held with someone unseen. He also demanded that his royal scribes write down everything he said, as though transcribing divine revelations. When Leonard finally recovered, he was no longer the same man. He declared before his court that, throughout his illness, he had been visited by a young woman who appeared and vanished like a spirit. She called herself a messenger from another world and revealed to him truths that would later be deemed heresy. The woman told him that the so-called tale of the 6 legacies, as preserved in the Mauryan chronicles, was a lie, a web of deceit meant to lead humanity astray. In the days that followed, she revealed to him that while the 6 legacies were indeed real, their true meaning had been twisted and corrupted. Moreover, she spoke of a 7th legacy, the most important of them all, a prophecy written by Rose herself during her reign as Queen of Zenereth. This 7th legacy, she claimed, contained knowledge powerful enough to change the world, knowledge that his servants had deliberately concealed, ensuring it would never reach the realm of men. They made certain it was lost and forgotten forever. When the king asked who he was, the mysterious woman replied, "He who brings forth chaos." Leonard also spoke of other blasphemous revelations, that Rose had not sought vengeance upon her brothers, but rather forgave them and let them live, that for centuries an unseen war had raged between his blood and hers, and that one day 2 dynasties would be destined to wage war over who shall inherit this world. Naturally, his wife, his children, and everyone at the royal court believed the king had lost his mind. They blamed the head injury, a severe concussion, they said, that had left him prone to delusions and hallucinations. But Leonard would not be silenced. From the moment of his recovery, he became deeply devout. He ordered the construction of dozens of temples throughout the realm, all dedicated to the Supreme One, Ross, whom, according to the mysterious visitor, mankind should truly worship. He also commanded that a new record be written, the Drayan Chronicles, alternative version of humans' history, containing every word the spirit woman had told him. Word of the mad king of Drayan spread quickly across the New Lands. Within a few short years, nearly every soul had heard the tale of the 7th legacy, a mystical, forbidden prophecy, lost to time, yet whispered still. Of course, the 7th legacy was never recognized as real by the Kia High Council. They branded both the prophecy and everything that had befallen King Leonard as the heretical ravings of a madman, and indeed it might have quickly faded into obscurity, were it not for what happened a few decades later. Without warning, similar incidents began to occur, First, a 9-year-old child in Travia claimed to have been visited by a mysterious woman who spoke of the seventh legacy. Then, a young scholar at the Nandian Academy in Cordell reported the same. And not long after, the wife of the Lord of the Isles of Misery declared that she too had been visited by a radiant figure who whispered to her of a hidden truth, the same truth revealed once to Leonard. What began as the delusions of a broken king soon transformed into a movement, a growing faith of men and women who believed in the existence of the seventh legacy and who dared to claim that the history known to the people of the New Lands was a lie. They called themselves the Remembered, and their creed was simple. The truth was buried, and we are the hands that will unearth it. Now, as Alexandra held in her hands what might truly be the semi-legendary legacy, once dismissed as heresy and myth, a shiver raced through her entire body, as if the very air around her had turned electric. "You did well, Taman," she whispered, her voice carrying both awe and solemn reverence. "Since the council has spent all this time denying its existence, branding Leonard as a madman, a heretic, who would have known it was real? And even if they had known, why would they have ever needed it?" she continued, her voice growing steadier, firmer as she grasped his hand with a sense of resolute purpose. "Taman, no one must ever know that you found it. Not a soul. And certainly not that you kept it hidden for yourself," she said, her gaze piercing his, heavy with the weight of their shared secret. "I understand," Taman replied, his voice low but unwavering, carrying the gravity of their discovery. "That is why I told those who unearthed the tomb with me that I had burned the parchment. It would have served no one here. In the safety of these walls, I chose to reveal it to only one person, you. For in your veins flows the blood of Leonard, and the truth, in all its power and peril, belongs to your family, to you." Their eyes locked, a long, tense silence filling the room. And in that moment, for the first time in countless years, a spark flared between them. A spark of understanding, of shared destiny, of purpose bound not by fear, but by the inescapable gravity of the legacy they now carried. "We need to think about what we're going to do with it," said Alexandra, suddenly releasing her husband's hand, as if reminded of the chasm that had separated them all these years. "I've sent a letter to the master of the Order of the Followers," Taman replied. "I requested one of his finest men to assist me with the escort. I didn't say what it was exactly, only that it's a matter of state importance. That should be enough for them to respond and send a knight as quickly as possible." As he spoke, Taman averted his gaze from his wife, stood up from the bed, and began pacing the room, as though thinking aloud. "Good. That's a wise decision," Alexandra said, watching him. "The knight's followers are known for their loyalty and discretion, but where exactly do you plan to escort it?" "I'm going to the capital," Taman answered. "Your parents, the king and queen, must know. There are scholars and historians in the royal court who may recognize the language in which the legacy was written." "I'm coming with you," said Alexandra firmly. "Now that I'm the only one you've trusted with this secret, I won't let you face it alone. Besides, I want to make sure the truth reaches my parents, whether through you or through me." "It's too dangerous. I won't risk your safety," Taman said, his voice carrying something Alexandra hadn't heard since the day they were wed, genuine concern. "You already risked enough by telling me about your discovery," she replied, her tone resolute. "One short journey won't change that." "Very well," Taman said after a pause. "As soon as the knight follower arrives, we'll depart for the capital. But now, if you'll excuse me, there's one more matter I must attend to." He gave the princess one last, lingering look, a glance heavy with unspoken thoughts, before turning away and leaving the chamber. The corridors of the castle were silent, save for the distant howl of the wind. By the time he reached his own chambers, every trace of weariness had returned, yet he knew sleep would not come easily that night. Not after what he had seen, what he had learned, and what he now carried upon his shoulders. He lay upon his bed, staring at the ceiling as the fire in the hearth dimmed to a dull glow. Thoughts circled in his mind like vultures over a dying beast, For a long while, he turned from one side to the other, wrestling with restlessness and doubt, until at last, exhaustion claimed him. No sooner had his eyes closed than the world around him shifted. The cold stone of the chamber melted into sand and ash. A wind full of salt and death brushed his face. He stood once more among his men, in the midst of a makeshift camp of tents, their pale canvas shivering under the bleak sky of the Dead Isles. "Lord, here, you need to see this," shouted one of his soldiers, his voice breaking through the moan of the sea wind. Taman rose from beside the campfire and followed him through the maze of tents, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The air smelled of rot and iron, and every gust carried with it the taste of decay. When they reached the edge of the encampment, the soldier stopped abruptly and pointed ahead, his face pale, his hands trembling. Before them lay ruins overgrown with moss, the remnants, perhaps, of what had once been a sacred structure. Taman stepped closer, accompanied by 3 of his men. The ground beneath their boots was soft with wild grass instead of stone, and insects drifted lazily through shafts of pale light. From the shattered arches above came the steady drip of water and the distant cries of crows circling overhead. "Here, my lord," said the young soldier again, his voice low, uneasy. Taman approached, and in the center of the ruin saw what looked like a tomb, a crude, stone-covered mound. "I want to see what's inside," he said firmly. "Shall we break it open, my lord?" another man asked. "Yes. Tear down the stones and dig beneath the earth. Call me when you find something." Taman turned and stepped outside, letting the cold air wash over him. For a while he stood motionless, his gaze lost in the dull, gray sky above. "Even the heavens over these islands are abandoned by the gods," he murmured to himself. Then came the screams. He spun around and rushed back into the ruin. What he saw froze his blood. From the disturbed grave poured a writhing mass of worms and serpents, spilling over the grass like a living tide. Dozens of crows had descended from the broken roof, swarming the tomb in a frenzy. And from within the grave itself rose a shadow. Vast, shapeless, terrible, commanding the creatures around it with a voice that rattled the air. The crows fell upon one soldier, pecking and tearing, until his cries were swallowed by the beating of wings. Snakes coiled around another, crushing his ribs until his body went limp. The third man dropped his torch, his skin crawling with worms that slithered into his mouth, nose, and eyes until his body collapsed into silence. Taman staggered backward, his legs weakening, until he fell to the damp ground. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I am the one who brings forth chaos," the shadow answered, its tone like a breath of smoke, cold and ancient. Then it lunged forward, passing straight through him, and vanished into the storm outside. For a long moment Taman lay there, shaking, before pushing himself to his feet. He stared at the horror before him, his men, lifeless, scattered among the ruin. "I'm sorry," he murmured to the corpses. I didn't know it would end like this." He stepped closer to the desecrated tomb. Amid the rubble and soil lay a skeleton, clutching something tightly in its bony hands, a fragment of parchment. Taman carefully pulled it free. To his astonishment, the parchment was untouched by time, its texture smooth, the ink dark and fresh. The writing upon it was in a language he had never seen, ancient, indecipherable, perhaps long lost to the world. He folded it gently and slipped it into his coat, then turned and fled the ruins, his heart pounding. When he returned to camp, he spoke of an attack, of wild wolves that had ambushed his patrol. He claimed he alone had survived, by sheer luck, while the others perished bravely. But in the silence of that night, as the fire burned low, he heard it again. That voice. I am the one who brings forth chaos. Taemon's eyes snapped open. He gasped for air, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't tell Alexandra the full story. He never would. Not about the ruin. Not about the dying screams of his men. Or how he had frozen, too terrified to save them. And certainly not about the shadow that rose from the grave. No one would have believed him anyway. They'd say he'd lost his mind. But one question still haunted him, clawing at the edge of every dream. Why had the council sent him there? And what truly was the seventh legacy, that cursed secret for which his men had died on those forsaken isles? A storm was raging over the northern reaches of Drayan. Though it was day, the sky hung low and colorless, thick gray clouds smothering the sun until the land itself seemed drained of life. Wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying with it the bite of snow and the echo of something ancient. The world was little more than white and shadow, and every footprint vanished as soon as it was made. From the veil of snow emerged a lone figure on horseback. The rider's cloak was dark and heavy, his hood drawn deep to shield him from the cold. His steed, a broad-chested stallion, pressed forward through the snow, its breath steaming in the frigid air. Ahead, the walls of Naumburg loomed, a fortress city carved into the mountainside, half swallowed by the storm. Atop the gatehouse, a guard peered into the whirling snow. He lifted a lantern, the faint light cutting through the white chaos. "Who goes there?" he called out, his voice nearly lost to the wind. The rider halted before the closed gates. Slowly he reached into the leather satchel at his side and withdrew a sealed parchment. The wax crest glinted faintly in the lantern's light. "I carry permission to enter," the rider said, his tone calm and steady. The guard leaned closer, recognized the mark, and straightened at once. "Open the gates!" he shouted down. The wooden doors creaked as they swung open, their hinges groaning under the weight of ice. The rider led his horse forward into the shadowed passageway. One of the inner guards took the parchment, inspecting it with care. "The seal of the order," he murmured. "From the Grand Master," the rider replied. The man hesitated, then nodded respectfully. "Very well. Proceed." The rider entered the city. Behind him, the gates closed with a heavy, echoing thud, the kind that seemed to seal away both snow and secrets. The streets of Naumburg were narrow and half-buried beneath snowdrifts. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, pale and uncertain against the darkening sky. At the edge of the square stood a tavern, its wooden sign rimed with frost and creaking in the wind, the words barely legible. "Lucky Ollie." The rider dismounted, brushing snow from his shoulders. He led his horse under a low wooden awning and tied the reins to a post. Nearby, a red-faced man slumped against a barrel, snoring drunkenly, with a half-empty mug dangling from his hand. "See that the horse is fed," said the rider, tossing 3 coins onto the man's chest. The drunk blinked open one eye, grunted, and pocketed the money. Without another word, the rider turned toward the tavern door and stepped inside. The warmth hit him at once, smoke, ale, and the faint sound of a lute being played somewhere in the corner. Candlelight flickered across worn wooden beams and rough-hewn tables. A handful of patrons lingered in silence, faces dimly lit, eyes tired. Behind the counter, an older woman in a linen apron wiped tankards with a coarse cloth. She looked up when the stranger entered, her gaze lingering on the cloak, the sword at his belt, and the sigil stitched onto his sleeve, the emblem of the Order of the Night Followers of Ross. The Order of the Night Followers was born in the year 336 after the Great Migration, founded by Sir Olfand of House Rins, a man whose name, even centuries later, was still spoken with a kind of sacred awe. Olfand had once served as a royal knight under King Leonard the Soothsayer, the very ruler whom many called mad, the blasphemer who claimed to have spoken with a spirit from another world. Yet while others mocked or turned away, Olfand believed. Some whispered that he was the first to believe, the first to kneel before the king, not as a subject, but as a disciple, pledging himself to the defense of what Leonard called truth. When the Drayan Chronicles were written, Olfand stood before the king and offered him a vision, a brotherhood of knights bound not by crown or gold, but by faith, secrecy, and purpose. Together they shaped the beginnings of what would become one of the most elite and enigmatic knightly orders in the New Lands, the Order of the Knight Followers of Ross. Their purpose was simple yet sacred, to guard the revelations entrusted to Leonard and ensure that the truth about the existence of the Seventh Legacies would never be lost again, nor fall into the wrong hands. Alongside the two other great orders in New Lands, the Servants of Caden, the largest brotherhood numbering over 18,000 men and based in Harasta Cordell, and the Children of Ignis, the fiery Travian order that welcomed both men and women. The Knight Followers were few, but unmatched. Barely 5,000 in number, they were said to be worth 3 times that many ordinary knights. And perhaps it was true. To become a Knight Follower was not merely a challenge. It was a trial by faith and blood. Only men of Drayan descent could apply, or at least those who carried Drayan blood through their mother's or father's line. Each candidate had to be born into a faithful family and anointed in infancy at one of the sacred temples of the High Ross. Then came the real test. 7 years of brutal, soul-shaping training. Their stronghold, known as the Whispering Fortress, stood alone upon the Isle of Serpents, far to the northwest of Rambertia. From that coastal city, once each year, ships departed carrying the new aspirants, boys of 12 or 13, across the storm-bitten sea. Few ever returned. The training was said to break a man down until nothing remained but his faith and will. Those who survived were taught not only the art of the sword and the ways of war, but also medicine, history, and the craft of silence, how to disappear, to blend with the wind, to see the enemy before being seen. They were hunters, healers, and executioners of the unseen. And when, after years of trial, a boy was at last knighted in the royal keep of Drayan by the hand of the king himself, he was no longer merely a soldier. He was initiated into the deeper mysteries of the Order, the secrets of Ross, and sworn to guard them unto death. The duties of the Knight Followers stretched beyond the walls of their fortress. They served as personal protectors to the royal family of Drayan, defenders of its borders, and guardians of its faith. They hunted the faithless, purged the corrupt, and brought thieves, traitors, and blasphemers before the throne for judgment. Their presence on the roads of the kingdom had become almost symbolic, the glint of their armor often enough to restore silence in the streets. Yet few outside the royal court knew that the Order's allegiance ran deeper than politics. King Leonard himself had granted the Grand Master of the Knight Followers the right of sacred judgment, the power to sentence those whose crimes defied divine law. Thus, not all prisoners were taken to the capital. Some were sent instead to the Isle of Serpents, where the whispers of the condemned were said to fade into the sea, never to be heard again. "How many nights you stayin'?" asked the woman at the bar, reaching for a mug. "I don't plan to," the rider replied. "Just until the storm passes, 1 honey ale." She poured the drink, shaking her head. "Hope's a poor thing in these mountains. Storm like this can last 2 days. Then 1 night," he said simply, placing several silver coins on the counter. "A plain bed will do." The woman scooped up the coins and called toward the back. "Millie, room upstairs. Quick now, we've got a guest." A teenage girl appeared, rubbing her eyes, and trudged up the stairs without a word. The rider sat at the bar, his gloves damp, cloak glistening faintly with melting frost. Beside him, a broad man with dark hair and a black eye patch turned to look at him. His voice was deep, touched by a southern accent. "You ride this far north and you're not tired?" The rider took a slow sip of his ale. "I am. But rest can wait." The man's lips curved in a faint smirk. "So you're not one of the soft ones." His gaze shifted to the emblem on the stranger's arm. "A night follower, eh? What's one of your kind doing in a place like this?" The rider said nothing. "Don't tell me," the man chuckled. "Running from duty?" In one sharp motion, the rider caught his wrist and twisted it upward. There, burned into the skin, was a spiral-shaped scar. "And you?" the rider asked evenly. "An outlaw, hiding from your past?" The man exhaled slowly, reclaiming his hand. "You don't hide from the past," he said. "You learn to live with it." "Then why are you here?" "This city's sealed," the rider continued. "You don't just wander in." The man finished his drink in one gulp, wiped the foam from his beard. "I was invited," he said after a pause. "I'm looking for something." "For what?" asked the knight. He looked at the rider for a long moment. "I don't trust your kind." He dropped a few coins on the counter and stood. "Because we hunt men like you?" the rider asked quietly. No answer. The man turned and disappeared up the stairs. The knight remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the flickering candles. The lute's soft tune continued to play in the background, a fragile melody, trembling at the edge of silence, while the storm outside raged on. Daylight had long since faded into stormlight when night fell upon Naumburg. The snow had stopped its furious dance, leaving behind a white silence that wrapped the city like a shroud. Inside the wooden walls of the Lucky Ollie, the world seemed still, or nearly so. A single candle trembled on a nightstand, its flame bending to the draft that crept through the window shutters. In its faint light sat the stranger, the hooded rider who had entered Naumburg earlier that day, crossing the frozen roads beneath the gray light of the storm. He had shed his armor and cloak, wearing only a loose linen tunic, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, a small leather-bound book of prayers resting open in his hands. His posture was straight, composed, as though carved from discipline itself. From beyond the wall came muffled laughter, the rhythmic creak of a bed, and the moaning of drunken pleasure. The knight's jaw tightened. He closed his eyes, lips moving silently. "You who stand above all gods," he whispered, "hear me now, and grant me strength." But the noise grew louder, crude, and shameless. He snapped the book shut. The candlelight glinted across its embossed cover, the mark of an oak leaf. "Forgive me, O highest, for my sinful nature," he murmured, sliding the book into his satchel. Moments later, anger and irritation wrestled within him. He threw on a nightshirt, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. The laughter was coming from the room next to his. He struck the door twice with his fist. Bang, bang. "Can't you tell we're busy?" came a man's muffled shout from within. The knight kicked the door hard. The laughter stopped. After a pause, the door creaked open and a red-haired woman appeared, bare and smirking, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "Want to join us, handsome?" "Stand aside, woman." His voice was sharp, cold steel in sound. He pushed her aside and strode into the room. Zanar, the one-eyed man from downstairs, was sprawled across the bed, his scarred body half covered by a black-haired prostitute. When he saw the intruder, he frowned, lips curling in amusement. "What now, little knight?" he drawled. "Tired of your vows? I can spare one if you're begging." The women laughed, one of them slinking up behind the knight, hands brushing his shoulders. "Let me show you a real piece of heaven," the redhead whispered. He recoiled, turning on her with eyes like blades. "Ever heard of nighttime silence, criminal?" His tone was as cold as the storm outside. "Or is self-control another foreign concept where you crawled from?" I don't know what passes for decency in your part of the world, but some of us still hold ourselves to a higher standard." Zainor raised an eyebrow, then waved the women away. "Give us a moment, darlings." They laughed again, teasing him on their way out. When the door closed, the room fell into tense quiet. Zainor groaned, rose, and reached for his shirt, the candlelight tracing the scars across his back. "Listen here, preacher boy," he grumbled, pulling the fabric over his head. "It took me 3 damned moons to reach this icy hole. A boat that nearly drowned me, nights sleeping in border queues like a caged dog, days through your cursed Drayan mountains. And for what? To freeze in this land of boredom? I won't let some self-righteous virgin ruin my hard-earned rest." He stepped closer, chest to chest, his breath heavy with ale and resentment. The knight looked up at him calmly. "If I were you," he said, voice low, "I'd bathe before resting. You smell like a butcher's apron left too long in the sun." Zainor's eyes flared. He grabbed the knight by the collar. "What did you say?" The knight's gaze didn't waver. "Either you and your filth quiet down," he said evenly, "or you'll wish the Travian guards had taken that marked hand of yours when they had the chance." Zainor froze. His grip loosened. After a moment, he scoffed and stepped back. "Brave words," he muttered. "You think being on home soil makes you bold? You preachers pose as saints, but the world knows better. You're rotten, hypocrites with blood on your hands. My mother once told me to beware those who speak sweet and look clean. Their hearts are closest to cruelty." He spat near the knight's feet. "Get out of my room." The knight stared at him for a heartbeat, then turned to leave. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "It's men like you who remind me why I chose this path, to be a shield for what's good and just." He left, closing the door behind him. Zainor's laughter followed, dark and humorless. "Judgment isn't yours to give, follower. You and your order take on too many burdens." Back in his room, the knight extinguished the candle and lay on the bed, eyes open to the darkness. The wind howled outside, but within him a different storm stirred. Silent, relentless, and heavy with unspoken purpose. After several days of unrelenting blizzards and impenetrable darkness, the sun at last broke through above Naumburg. Its light, pale and hesitant at first, soon poured across the land, like a golden blade cutting through the remnants of night. The first rays touched the mountain peaks, then slipped down to the pine forests, glimmering upon the endless sheets of snow that blanketed the city like a white shroud. When the day fully dawned, the night follower left the tavern behind and made his way through the awakening streets. The air was sharp and clean after the storm, the silence of snow broken only by the distant tolling of church bells and the creak of wagon wheels rediscovering the roads. Ahead, on a high hill overlooking the city, rose the castle, its black stone walls glistening with frost, its towers piercing the pale sky like watchful sentinels. It was there he was bound. Word of his arrival spread quickly through the keep. When Lord Taman was informed that the knight he had so long awaited, the one summoned from the Order of the Followers, had finally reached Naumburg, he wasted no time. Turning to his wife, he spoke quietly but with intent. "Go, Alexandra. Greet him as our guest. See that he finds warmth and rest within these walls. I will join you as soon as I can. I just need to settle a few matters with Kanar." And so it was the princess, rather than her husband, who descended the marble steps of the great hall to meet the stranger, the man who had come through storm and silence, bearing the seal of the order and the promise of answers long awaited. The outer gate of Naumburg Castle rose with a long, metallic groan, the sound of old chains grinding against the cold morning air. Through the rising portcullis rode a solitary figure, a night follower, his cloak heavy with frost, his steed's breath clouding the air in pale mist. The rider advanced at a measured pace across the snow-covered courtyard. Each step of his horse crunched softly over the frozen ground, passing between rows of sculpted trees and weathered statues veiled in white. Above him, the great towers of the castle loomed silent and solemn, their stone faces gleaming faintly beneath the reborn sunlight. Crossing the inner archway, he entered a smaller courtyard. There he drew the reins and dismounted. His boots sank deep into the fresh snow as he took in his surroundings, every motion calm, deliberate, his gaze sharp and steady. From the castle's great doors emerged two figures. The first, a tall woman draped in a fur-lined cloak of royal blue, carried herself with the poise of one long accustomed to command. The second followed a few paces behind, a younger girl with fair hair and striking blue eyes, quiet yet alert, her every movement precise and measured. The rider inclined his head in a formal bow. "Your Highness," he said, his voice clear and resonant in the crisp air. The lady stopped, studying him with faint surprise, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "You know who I am?" she asked. The knight lifted his head, his expression composed, his tone steady yet respectful. "Protecting the bloodline of Drayan's royal house is among the highest duties of a knight follower," he replied. "Of course I know who you are, my lady." A smile touched her lips, proud, but not unkind. "Then you may call me Lady Alexandra," she said. "And this is Didi, my loyal attendant and right hand." The girl inclined her head politely. The rider met her eyes for the briefest moment. The clear blue of her gaze caught the light like shards of ice. A silent understanding passed between them, the kind that needed no words. "And how shall we call you, knight?" Alexandra asked. He placed a gloved hand upon his chest. "I am Ludwig, my lady." "Ludwig?" she repeated, tasting the sound of the name. "A curious one. I don't believe I've heard it before." "It's not common in Drayan," he admitted. "I was born on the Isle of Swords. It is a local name there." Her brows lifted slightly, interest gleaming behind her calm demeanor. "The Isle of Swords, you say? That explains the accent," she mused. "It seems you will make for intriguing company, Ludwig." Before he could answer, she stepped closer and, with effortless grace, took his arm. "Come," she said. "Let me show you the castle and your quarters. You can tell me more of your homeland along the way." Snowflakes shimmered in the air as the two of them crossed the courtyard together, the lady of Nürnberg and the stranger from the Isle of Swords, their footsteps fading into the echoing corridors of stone. In Tamon's castle study, a heavy silence lingered, broken only by the faint rustle of parchment. Two scrolls lay upon the sturdy oak table, one already sealed with the Lord's signet, the other still waiting for Tamon's own mark. He leaned over, finishing his signature with careful precision, then rolled the parchment and pressed his wax seal into place. Once done, he handed it to Canar, who accepted it with a slight bow. "So it is decided," Tamon said, lifting his gaze. 3 moons for me to gather for you several dozen of the finest men, and for you, time to convince the Travian lords to support my candidacy in the upcoming elections. Canar clasped his hand firmly, a confident smile on his face. "Indeed, my friend. I hope each of us will honor our terms." At that moment, a knock at the door shattered the quiet. "My lord, another guest waits at the castle gate. He claims he was invited by you," a guard's voice called from outside. Tamon raised an eyebrow and spoke loud enough for the man to hear. "Very well. Let him enter and wait for me in the courtyard." Canar frowned, a mix of curiosity and amusement in his eyes. "Another guest?" he asked. "How many of your knight followers have you summoned here already?" Tamon's lips curled in a faint smile, excitement glimmering in his gaze. "This time, Canar, it is not a knight. It is something entirely different." "All right, now let's go. I don't want my guests waiting too long," Tamon added. With that, the two men rose from their seats and headed toward the door, ready to see who had come to the castle. Meanwhile, Alexandra walked alongside the knight follower, guiding him down the corridor toward the guest chambers. The princess's arm rested lightly on his as he towered over her by a head. Behind them, like a shadow never far away, Didi followed silently. "Tell me, Ludwig," Alexandra asked, her voice calm but curious. "What is it like to be a night follower?" He walked with measured steps, his eyes ahead, voice steady. "Many believe we serve only to reflect Ross's virtues. Wisdom, balance, humility. But the world we live in now barely remembers what those words mean. Sometimes I think our true duty is not to preserve order, but to restore it. Even if that means letting the old order crumble. The old order, if any order ever existed at all," Alexandra replied softly, her tone thoughtful. "So you think destruction is the way?" "Not destruction," he answered, his gaze never faltering. "Rebirth. A field must be cleared before new crops can grow, and some roots, the oldest, most rotten ones, must be burned away completely." There was a weight in his voice, a conviction that made Alexandra pause, sensing the depth of his thoughts. "You speak like a philosopher, or a prophet," she murmured. "Just a servant, Your Highness," he said simply. At last they reached the salon. Alexandra gestured toward Didi. "Didi, would you assist our guest?" The young servant moved forward, helping Ludwig remove his cloak. Alexandra indicated a crimson sofa and a small table where a pitcher of wine waited. "Ludwig, make yourself at home. Sit, have some wine. Didi will keep you company while I go to fetch my husband," she said, her eyes lingering on him for a brief moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the trust she placed in him. Alexandra gave a delicate bow and left the room, leaving the rider and the young servant girl alone. "Sir, would you like some wine?" Didi asked, approaching the table where the pitcher stood. "I will not refuse good wine. After weeks on the road, I long to taste the warmth and calm that flows from a proper cup," the rider replied. "You didn't come directly from the Order's stronghold, did you?" the girl asked, pouring the wine. "Pardon?" he responded, clearly surprised by her question. "You said weeks of travel, yet the journey from the Isle of Serpents here takes just over a week," Didi said, stepping closer to the rider, who had settled comfortably on the sofa. She handed him the goblet, fixing him with a heavy, piercing gaze. "Ah, yes. I was on duty at the Cordell border. Matters there have worsened recently. More and more people try to cross into Drayan illegally, so the Order sends as many men as possible," the rider explained. "You said where you're from, sir?" Didi continued, this time brushing the snow off his cloak, which she then hung on a nearby rack. "The Isle of Swords. It is a small island," he began, a note of unease threading through his voice as he spoke. "South of Valen. Yes, I've heard many tales about that island. One says that the lord who ruled it was so cruel he drove it into crisis. The people rebelled, and the lord and his family were forced to flee. After their departure, the villagers turned on one another, burning each other's homes and fields, and the livestock was slaughtered or driven away. The island, which relied almost entirely on agriculture, could no longer sustain anyone, and everyone fled in search of a better life. In time, it became utterly abandoned, forgotten even by the gods," Didi recounted. She then turned, giving the rider a sharp, assessing look, as if silently asking, "Who are you, really?" "But that story happened half a century ago. Since then, there hasn't been a single living soul on that island," she added, watching his reaction carefully. The rider swallowed. "I do not know who you truly are, sir, but be careful that your secrets do not become your undoing. My lady may not know the island's history, but I am not so easily deceived," Didi said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "And you, girl? A mere servant who knows so much?" "Perhaps I am not the only one here hiding something," Ludwig finally replied, raising an eyebrow. "Knowledge is not a secret that needs hiding, sir. There are many secrets in this world, but not all of them are worth discovering," Didi answered calmly. Then the night follower leaned slightly forward and added quietly, And some of these secrets outlive those who guard them. Didi froze for a moment. She looked at the night follower and said softly, "Indeed, they do." In the way they looked at each other, there was something unspoken that both understood, yet neither dared voice aloud. Suddenly, the door opened, and 4 figures stepped into the room. Kanar, Tamin, Zaynar, and Alexandra. The rider rose abruptly from the sofa as a familiar face appeared in the doorway. "What is he doing here?" Ludwig's voice was sharp, his gray eyes fixed on Zaynar. Zaynar, in response, offered only a smile, slick, almost mocking, as if he enjoyed the tension it caused. "You two know each other?" Alexandra's voice cut through the room, her gaze moving between the men with a mix of curiosity and caution. "We had the pleasure of staying under the same roof, Your Highness," Zaynar replied smoothly, his tone deceptively calm. "Ludwig, isn't it?" Tamin stepped forward, his presence commanding yet measured. "We are grateful that the Order answered my call and sent you here." "It is part of our service to Drayan, my lord," the young knight follower said, bowing his head respectfully. "If you will allow, we should speak privately," Tamin added quietly, inclining his head toward Ludwig. The knight gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the request without a word. "Excuse us," Tamin said, addressing the others. He moved toward the door, Ludwig close at his side. Together they stepped out into the courtyard. Alexandra, refusing to overlook Dryanian hospitality even for a moment, poured wine for the remaining guests. She gestured toward the table, inviting Zaynar to sit, her expression courteous but wary. "So, Zaynar, you hail from Travia as well?" Kanar asked, seated comfortably in his luxurious, colorful garments that spoke of the wealth and opulence he had amassed as a prosperous merchant. He wore a brolida, a distinctive tunic that marked the southern Travian elite. Typically, a brolida was crafted from the finest silks, velvets, and brocades, its fabric combining at least 3 rich, contrasting colors. Intricate floral motifs and gilded stripes adorned the garment, each detail reflecting painstaking craftsmanship. Not every Travian could afford a brolida. Beyond demonstrating refined taste, it was a silent emblem of social standing, a signal of both wealth and influence for anyone who wore it. "Indeed, I come from Enifia, a small town in the north of the kingdom," Zaynar replied, leaning back casually, showing no effort to hide the spiral-shaped mark on his hand. "Ah, Enifia," Kanar said, a reminiscent smile tugging at his lips. "I once spent several months there. A town of wild nights, reckless revelry, and women as untamed as young steeds." Alexandra frowned at his words, her gaze sharpening. Kanar's eyes flicked to Zaynar's hand, lingering on the spiral etched into his skin. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Interesting mark you carry, Zaynar," he said, his tone casual but edged with meaning. Zaynar stiffened, his gaze narrowing. "What are you implying?" Alexandra, sensing the shift in the conversation, frowned, her gray eyes sharpening. "Kanar, what is he talking about?" Kanar leaned back, fingers steepled. "In Travia, we do not have prisons, nor do we behead those who transgress. Our justice is more permanent. The royal guard, when they catch a criminal, brand a symbol upon their hand, one that tells the world the nature of the crime committed." He let the words hang for a moment, letting the weight of them sink in. "A crossed triangle marks a rapist, a 4-pointed star an embezzler or deceiver, a sword blade a murderer, and the spiral, as you see, marks a thief." He let his eyes drift to Zaynar again. "Once branded, the criminal is set free. But freedom comes at a cost. From that day onward, life ceases to be kind. No town welcomes him. No employer trusts him. No woman binds herself to him. The symbol becomes his punishment, social exile, a lifetime of suspicion and exclusion." He paused, then added quietly, "Some try to remove it, cut off the hand it's on, claiming it lost in battle. But in recent years, so many have done this that hardly anyone believes the story. The mark remains in spirit, if not in flesh. Among Travians there is a saying, "No matter how fast you run, the past will catch you." Zainar's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. Alexandra's gray eyes widened slightly, absorbing the grim truth behind Kanar's words. The air in the room grew heavier, charged with unspoken histories and the weight of Travian law. "Here in Drayan, we do not judge others by what they once were, Kanar," Alexandra said suddenly, her voice calm yet firm. "We judge by what they choose to be now. We do not say, 'He will betray us tomorrow because he betrayed someone yesterday.' The past does not define what we may become." Kanar's gaze flickered toward her, and in his eyes smoldered something darker, a hint of wounded pride and a bitterness he could no longer quite conceal. Who is this branded wanderer that she would defend him so eagerly, he thought, and why must she always speak of her husband with such warmth? "My husband mentioned, Zanar, that you are one of the finest scouts in the New Lands. Is that true?" Alexandra continued, the faintest smile playing on her lips, as if deliberately twisting the knife. "I fear your husband may have overstated my merits, my lady," Zanar replied modestly. "Before I was marked, I served at the royal court of Travia, even under the queen herself. I worked for lords and princes alike. But those days are long gone. Now I travel where I am needed, and where the coin is fair." "You may rest assured, then," Alexandra said, her smile soft yet meaningful, "that my husband rewards well those who serve him faithfully. He is a generous ruler, and a fair one." Kanar forced a smile, sharp and thin as a blade. He lifted his goblet, the wine within trembling slightly in the firelight. "Then let us drink," he said, his voice velvet smooth, but carrying a sting beneath. "To generous rulers who pay well, to loyal scouts who never lose their way, and to noble ladies whose kindness shines brighter than their husbands' crowns." For a heartbeat, the air stilled, as if even the flames themselves waited. Then all three raised their cups. The sound of glass touching glass rang softly through the chamber, delicate yet tense, like a string drawn too tight. Alexandra's gray eyes met Kanar's across the table. It was that look, the one that had undone far stronger men than he. Since the day she had discovered the true power of her presence, her louder femininity, as the courtiers once whispered, she had wielded it like a blade wrapped in silk. Her gaze could entice or destroy. It could whisper, "Tonight, I am yours," and in the same breath warn, "But you have not yet earned me." Kanar felt that gaze now, cutting through his carefully guarded composure. It ignited something deep and dark within him, a hunger he despised, a weakness he both loathed and craved. He hated that she could unmake him with a single look. He hated even more that he wanted her to. He would have traded every gold coin in his caravans, every gem and every favor owed to him across the New Lands, just to keep that look, that fleeting spark of dangerous attention, for himself. Not for Taman, not for this branded wanderer, but for him. And so he smiled, hollow and wounded, as the wine burned down his throat like molten envy. Zanar watched them both with a faint, knowing smile, his single eye reflecting the soft glow of the fire. There was something almost amusing in their unspoken dance, her teasing glances, Kanar's wounded pride, the tension that shimmered between them like a drawn bowstring. Yet beneath that amusement lingered something else, something heavier. Relief, perhaps. Or resignation. Once he too had played that game, had loved, had lost, had burned for women whose eyes promised everything and delivered ruin. There had been many in his life, noble ladies who whispered forbidden words behind velvet curtains, widows with trembling hands, and servants who wanted to taste danger. But none had stayed in his memory like her. Tarnalia. He met her years ago, on the border between Travia's central and eastern provinces, a land of misty fields, scattered ruins, and long-forgotten roads where few dared to travel after dark. She was a huntress and a sellsword, fierce and cunning, with the fire of rebellion in her eyes and the kind of beauty that came with danger. Together they took a contract from one of the richest lords of the capital to oversee the transport of his gold from one city to another, guarding it from the bands of outlaws that prowled the trade routes. But greed has a sharper edge than any blade. Tarnalia and 2 of her companions had conceived a better plan, not to guard the treasure, but to take it. When Zaynor refused to join them, they decided to make him their scapegoat. On the night of the ambush, under the cover of fog, the convoy was attacked. The guards were slaughtered, the wagons emptied, the gold gone by dawn. By the time the survivors limped back to the city, the story was already written, and every forged piece of evidence pointed to Zaynor. Witnesses claimed to have seen him flee into the forest with the thieves. His seal was found on one of the emptied chests. His horse, conveniently missing. They dragged him before the city magistrate, and when he spoke Tarnalia's name, no one listened. Her betrayal was complete, and her trail had long gone cold. The mark of the spiral was branded into his flesh, the mark of the thief, the oathbreaker. Since that day, Zaynor had stopped dividing people by their birth or beauty, wealth or title. The world, in all its cruel simplicity, now held only 2 kinds of souls: those who still carried a trace of human dignity, and those who had long since sold it to the highest bidder. Canar finished his wine, swirling the last drops in the goblet so that the firelight flickered across its rim. After a brief pause, he set it down with a soft clink and rose from his chair. "Zaynor," he said, his tone polite but edged with fatigue, or perhaps something sharper. "Forgive me, but I'll steal the princess away for a moment." He turned to Alexandra, adding with exaggerated courtesy, "If you allow it, my lady." Alexandra hesitated for a heartbeat, as if weighing his intent, then inclined her head gracefully. "Of course," she replied evenly, her gray eyes glinting with a cool composure. Then, turning to the Travian, she added, "Please, forgive us. If you need anything, Didi will gladly assist you." At her signal, the young servant, who had been standing silently by the door, stirred and stepped forward, hands clasped before her. She gave a small, hesitant curtsy. In her wide eyes flickered a mixture of curiosity and unease, the kind of uncertainty born of finding oneself in a room with a jealous merchant, a marked outlaw, and a princess whose very gaze could burn or bless. Alexandra then offered Zaynor a courteous bow of farewell before turning to Canar. Together they left the chamber, their footsteps fading down the long, torchlit corridor. Snow crunched beneath Alexandra and Canar's boots as they walked along the outer paths of the castle courtyard. The sun shone brightly, casting a crisp golden light over the snow-covered stones, making the entire courtyard sparkle. "So, Rambordia, you say?" Alexandra asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes," Canar replied. "I'll stay there a while." "Then you need to be careful," she said, her gaze moving across the sparkling courtyard. "The city and its surrounding lands are unlike any other place on Drayan's map. The indigenous people still live there, under the king's rule, but by their own laws." Canar chuckled softly. "Ah, yes. That's exactly what makes it so fascinating. You wouldn't guess it from looking at me, but I've always been captivated by native peoples and their customs, so different from those of the new lands. And I hear your uncle has been ruling there these past few years?" "Yes," Alexandra nodded. "My father appointed him as his right hand in that region. I ought to visit him someday. We haven't seen each other since I married Taman." Canar stopped mid-step and Alexandra instinctively halted beside him. "Alexandra," he said, his voice low. From the inner pocket of his fur cloak, he withdrew a small, dark brown vial. "I'd like to give you something," he said, pressing the delicate object into her palm. "A small farewell gift." "What is it? Another oil?" she asked, curiosity tinged with amusement. "Open it. Smell." She unscrewed the cap and inhaled. Her eyes widened instantly. "No. Is that—" she whispered. "Black rose extract. Where did you get this?" "A gift," Kanar replied calmly. "From a trade partner. You won't find it in Drayan." Alexandra turned the vial over in her hands, astonished. "It grows in only one place in the world, the highlands in Gelior. A very rare flower." Her voice trailed off, impressed despite herself. Kanar's eyes met hers, steady and intense. "As rare as a woman like you." Her breath caught. "Kanar," she whispered. "I mean it," he said, taking both her hands in his. "For someone like you, I'd give up all the treasures I've ever hoarded. Just remember my offer. If the day ever comes when you've had enough, I'll be waiting." Alexandra smiled faintly, a mix of wistfulness and warmth. "I'm afraid that day may never come." She lifted herself slightly on tiptoe, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. "And now I'm sorry. I need to return to our guest. Safe travels, Kanar." Their eyes lingered on each other, warm, conflicted, unspoken words passing silently between them. Then Alexandra turned and walked away, her figure gradually slipping through the stone archway. Kanar remained standing, watching her go. A stray lock of her hair lifted in the wind, dancing briefly before disappearing with her. A trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "We'll see about that," he murmured softly to himself. Travian Merchant was the type of man who did not like to give up, raised from childhood to believe that if he wanted something, he would have it, even if it meant pursuing a married Drayan princess, his forbidden fruit. The stone steps led downward, into the cold depths beneath the castle. Lord Taman and Ludwig descended in silence, their footsteps echoing faintly along the narrow corridor. The torches fixed to the damp walls flickered weakly, casting restless shadows across the rough stone. The air was heavy with moisture and the faint scent of rust and age. The passage seemed endless. On either side, rows of iron-barred cells stretched into darkness. Most stood empty, their silence haunted by the ghosts of long-forgotten prisoners. At last, Taman came to a halt before one of the cells. 2 guards stood beside it. They straightened immediately as their lord approached. Taman gave a short nod, then stepped closer to the bars. Ludwig joined him, peering through the dim light. Inside, upon a raised wooden platform, stood a chest. It was large, reinforced with dark iron, and secured by several heavy locks. An unfamiliar symbol was etched into its lid, faint but deliberate. Taman spoke first, his tone low. "Ludwig, tell me, what do you know about the 7th Legacy?" The knight blinked, surprised. "The 7th Legacy?" "Only what every other follower knows, my lord." Taman's eyes remained fixed on the chest. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, but heavier. "Do you and your brothers truly believe it exists?" The question hung in the cold air like a blade. It was not casual curiosity. It carried weight, urgency, and something deeper. Almost desperation. Ludwig turned to him. "It is the foundation of our order," he said firmly. "The followers were founded upon that belief, that not all myths are lies. The 7th Legacy is a symbol of the truth that was lost, hidden from us, perhaps on purpose." Taman's lips curved faintly. "And what if someone has already found that truth?" Ludwig frowned. "Found it? Found the 7th Legacy?" The lord's expression did not change. "Tomorrow at dawn, we depart." What we'll be escorting is worth more than gold, more than titles, more than any treasure in the kingdom, and I suppose many will want it for themselves. He took a slow step closer to the bars. I must ensure it reaches the capital safely. No one can know what we carry. We'll travel as if on an ordinary journey. Ludwig hesitated. If you want it to be an ordinary journey, then why you summoned me, my lord? A night follower? Because I'll need your help, Taman replied, turning toward him at last. The torchlight flickered across his sharp features. You'll come with us, but not as a knight. You'll disguise yourself as one of the servants. The knight's brow furrowed. A servant? You'll keep your sword, Taman continued calmly, but you'll be the one carrying the true cargo. Ludwig stiffened. Me? You want me to carry it? Taman stepped closer until his voice became almost a whisper. If anyone follows us, or tries to strike, they'll come for me, for my wife, the princess, or for our gold. No one will suspect a servant. That's why it must be you. For a moment, only the soft hiss of the torches filled the corridor. Somewhere deeper in the dungeons, a drop of water fell and echoed faintly. Finally, Ludwig gave a short nod. I understand, my lord. He glanced once more toward the cell. And what exactly is inside? Taman looked at him, his expression unreadable. Better that you don't know yet, Ludwig. The less you know, the safer we'll all be. Ludwig bowed slightly, then turned to leave. His boots echoed down the stone passage until his steps were swallowed by silence. Taman remained, standing before the cell. His gaze lingered on the chest, the flickering torchlight glinting across the iron locks. For a long moment he wrestled with a thought that pressed against the edge of his mind. He wanted to ask Ludwig one last question. Whether he had ever heard of the one who brings forth chaos. The words rose to his lips, but something, some invisible force, held them back. Perhaps it was instinct, or fear. Perhaps the quiet voice of his own conscience, whispering that even a devout follower might call him mad if he spoke of what had happened on the Dead Isles. The torches flickered again, casting long shadows over the floor. Taman exhaled slowly, pushing the thought away, and turned toward the stairs. He left the dungeon without another word. The hall of the Nürnberg castle was quiet again. Only Zainar and Didi remained. An uneasy silence hung in the air, thick, almost tangible. Zainar watched the girl with quiet curiosity, while she did everything she could to avoid his gaze. Girl, the Travian finally said, breaking the silence. Bring me some water. Didi said nothing. She only gave a small nod, walked to the table, and poured water from the jug into a cup. Then, with light steps, she approached the man sitting on the sofa. As she was about to set the cup down in front of him, Zainar suddenly reached out at the same time. Their hands brushed, a fleeting touch, yet enough to make her freeze for a heartbeat. She looked up at him, just for a moment, before quickly pulling back and lowering her gaze. Are you afraid of me, child? The one-eyed man asked. I have no reason to fear someone my lord trusts, she replied softly, still avoiding his eyes. And what if I turned out to be a murderer? He said, a faint, teasing smile curling his lips. They say the mark on your hand speaks of theft, not murder, Didi answered quietly. But to steal something, Zainar murmured, one might just as well kill the one who owns it. He said it almost playfully, as if testing her, watching how far he could push. Then why tell me that? She asked, finally meeting his gaze. Wouldn't a true murderer prefer to stay silent and strike when no one expects it? Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with defiance. For the first time, Zainar felt a flicker of respect, or perhaps amusement. How old are you, girl? He asked after a moment. Why do you ask? She replied cautiously. You remind me of someone. Your face looks familiar, he said, tilting his head slightly. I don't know who I could remind you of, she said, her tone firm, but I doubt we've ever met. I've spent most of my life here, in this castle. It was a lie, and not a very good one. Is that so? Zaynor asked with a faint smile. Then where does that lovely southern accent come from? Didi froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her mind raced for an excuse, any excuse, when suddenly she was spared the need to answer. The door opened and Alexandra stepped back into the room. I hope my brief absence hasn't caused any trouble, said Alexandra as she stepped into the room, her tone calm, but carrying quiet authority. Not at all, my lady, replied Zaynor, rising slightly from his seat. I found myself quite at ease in the company of your modest and loyal servant. As he spoke, his one remaining eye flicked toward Didi for the briefest moment, a glance accompanied by the faint trace of a smile that made her shift uncomfortably. I'm glad to hear that, Alexandra said with a polite nod. Well then, we should all rest before tomorrow's journey. Didi, you'll be coming with us, so pack your own things along with mine. Yes, my lady, the young maid answered obediently. She bowed gracefully and left the room, her soft steps fading down the corridor. As far as I know, Zaynor, you'll be traveling with us as far as the crossroads, said the woman, her tone composed, yet inquisitive. That's correct. The man with the spiral mark on his hand replied evenly. But from there, I'll have to take another path and bid you farewell. From Lord Taman, he had received his first assignment, to follow Kainar. The Lord had long since begun to doubt his old friend, though he concealed it with great skill. Zaynor was ordered to shadow Kainar on his journey to Ramburdia and uncover who his new trading partner was and what kind of cooperation bound them. The words, a sea voyage to uncharted waters, had been a red flag for Taman. His old friend, a wealthy merchant, well accustomed to traveling between islands and kingdoms, had always despised sea journeys. He suffered from dreadful seasickness and cursed every voyage that forced him aboard a ship. So when Taman heard him speak, with sudden enthusiasm, of venturing eastward to explore unknown lands and peoples, a journey that would take months upon the ocean, something in him stirred. His distrust of the Travian merchant grew stronger than ever. Taman's suspicions toward Kainar had not appeared overnight. For many years the two men had stood side by side, bound by shared interests, mutual profit, and what Taman once believed to be a genuine friendship. Kainar was clever, charming, and possessed a rare talent for turning even the most hopeless venture into gold. Taman often admired his intuition and fearlessness, qualities few merchants could boast. But something had changed in Kainar over the past year. He had grown distant, secretive, and far too cautious for a man who once trusted Taman with every trade agreement and every route across the new lands. He began keeping his ledgers locked, meeting strangers behind closed doors, and disappearing for weeks under vague excuses of negotiations. At first, Taman dismissed these changes as the natural caution of a man burdened by age and success. But then came the letters. Reports from Taman's informants in the southern ports spoke of Kainar's ships unloading goods that didn't exist on any of their manifests. Rare minerals, exotic fabrics, and strange spices from lands beyond the known maps. Even more troubling were the whispers that Kainar had been seen meeting travelers who did not look like men from any of the kingdoms of the new lands, tall figures with yellow-toned skin and weapons of unfamiliar design. Taman's instincts, sharpened by decades of trade, deceit, and diplomacy, told him that something larger was at play. Kainar, the man who once swore that the sea was his enemy, now sought to master it. He spoke of new beginnings, new alliances, and boundless opportunities, but never said with whom or for what purpose. Taman wanted to know what Kainar was hiding from him, and whether he could still be trusted. The fact that the merchant planned to spend an extended time in Ramburdia, here in Drayan, suggested that someone from their own land might be involved. Taman needed answers, but he could not rely on his usual network. If Kanar truly was working with someone within Drayan, then any of Taman's known agents could already be compromised. He needed someone new, someone unknown, unconnected, and capable of disappearing into the shadows. Meanwhile, in a tiny village 20 miles south of Naumburg, snow-draped forests pressed close to a small riverside settlement. The frozen river wound silently past thatched roofs, and gentle wisps of smoke drifted from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and hearth fire. In the front yard of a modest farmhouse, Emilda, her hair streaked with silver, her wool cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, scattered slop into a wooden trough for the pigs. The sudden crunch of wagon wheels on the snow made her freeze. She turned just in time to see a mule-drawn cart coming to a stop before the house. A heavy-set older man climbed down, brat, grim and urgent. "Emilda, quickly now, I need your help," he called, his voice taut with urgency. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over, a knot of worry tightening in her chest. On the cart lay a young man, his body bruised and battered, half covered by a coarse, worn blanket. Beside him, a dead doe and 2 rabbits rested in silence. "Grab his legs, I'll take the front. We'll get him inside," Brad instructed. Emilda hesitated for a heartbeat, shock rooting her to the spot, but she obeyed. Together they lifted the young man and carried him into the warmth of the house. By the stone stove, where a small fire sputtered and crackled, they gently laid him upon a bed. The air was thick with the mingling scents of smoke, herbs, and something undefinably sacred. "Gods above, who is he?" Emilda murmured, her voice trembling. "You'll see for yourself," Brat said, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Found him south, just past the glade. Poor lad was barely clinging to life." He pulled back the blanket. There, burned into the young man's shoulder, was a mark shaped like a star. Emilda gasped, her fingers trembling. "That's a follower of Ross," Brat said quietly, as if even speaking the name aloud carried weight. She stepped closer, studying the branded mark, her heart tightening with unease. "Is he still alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just barely," Brat replied. "If I'd found him a moment later, he would not have survived." A heavy silence fell over the room, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the muffled breathing of the young man. "He was conscious for a moment," Brat continued. "Said he'd been attacked, robbed of everything." "Attacked? Here?" Emilda's voice faltered. "This land hasn't seen true danger in years, and never against one of Ross's servants." She crossed to another cot, retrieved spare quilts and furs, and covered the young man with tender care, as if shielding a fragile flame from the wind. "I'll ride into town at first light," Brat said. "Our lord must be informed. If that bandit is still hiding in the nearby woods, any one of us could be next." The room held its breath. Outside, the snow lay silent, unbroken, yet a storm of unease pressed upon them all. On the young man's face, frost-bitten lips and a swollen temple told of his ordeal. His eyes remained closed, yet faint. Steady breaths rose from him, a fragile thread of life, defiant against the cold and cruelty of the world. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting pale gold across the snow-blanketed landscape, when Lord Taman set out on his journey with his wife, Alexandra. A dozen of his men accompanied them. Ludwig, disguised as a servant, walked beside them, while Zaner rode alongside the procession, tall and confident, and Didi rode with the princess as her devoted attendant. Taman led the way with 2 soldiers at his side. Behind them, several men followed on foot. Alexandra's wagon came next, the princess sitting with Didi. Ludwig trudged through the snow, keeping up his cover, and a handful of mounted guards brought up the rear. Their pace was slow, Even the main road from Nuremberg to the crossroads, where one path led to Rambertia, another southward, and a third toward the capital, was buried under several days of snowstorms. Zanar, perched firmly on his horse, glanced down at Ludwig every so often. The young man noticed but kept his expression neutral. "This outfit suits you better, little knight," Zanar said, breaking the silence. "Matches your rotten little heart more than anything else." "And you, bandit? You ride horses as well as whores and other cast-offs of society?" Ludwig shot back, eyes fixed on his rival. "At least I know what a woman's body tastes like," Zanar said, leaning slightly forward. "For you hypocritical virgins, that's probably a world you'll never see." "I'd rather taste blood, dripping from the sword I shoved through the chest of someone like you, than any woman," Ludwig snapped. "With all due respect to the Lord," Ludwig went on, tone deliberately biting, "he must have had a bad day when he hired a former criminal, unkempt, stinking foreigner like you, into a civilized kingdom, where rules and morals are so alien to your kind." "Don't worry, little knight," Zanar said with a grin. "You won't have to put up with me for long. Soon we hit the crossroads, and then we go our separate ways. Which, as it should be," Ludwig added, dry amusement in his voice. Snow crunched underfoot, wagons groaned as they strained through the drifts, and the wind bit at their faces. The faint echoes of their voices carried across the frozen plains. The tension between the two men was sharp, unyielding, like the icy ground beneath them, a dangerous game of words, hinting that this journey would test far more than endurance. Alexandra leaned slightly out of the covered wagon, her eyes scanning the snowy road ahead. "Zanar," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. "May I ask you something?" Zanar glanced down at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Of course, my lady." "Why do you wear the eye patch?" she asked, curiosity softening her tone. "To hide its absence, my lady," he replied lightly, as if the matter were trivial. Alexandra tilted her head, intrigued. "I'd like to hear about it, where and how you lost it. The journey ahead will be long, and I'd rather not be bored to death." "If the princess insists," Zanar said, settling himself more comfortably in the saddle. "It happened years ago, when I had already been forced to abandon my former life in Travia and seek a new place. Before I came to work on the Purple Isle, I first ended up on the Isle of Misery. It's a dangerous place on the maps of the New Lands, one that seafarers try to avoid. Though it technically belongs to Travia, the royal family has no real influence there. A governor resides in the Golden Palace, enjoying the gifts of the world, but the island is truly ruled by lawlessness. Criminal gangs, pirates, thief guilds, and swindlers. For years, the Morian forces tried to impose order, but without success. The chaos only worsened each year." He paused, his gaze darkening. "When I was marked with this symbol, I didn't know what to do with myself. Wherever I went, I felt the judging eyes of others, their distrust, and the lack of opportunity. Until one day, in a tavern, I met Black Roddy." "Black Roddy?" Alexandra asked, leaning closer, her interest piqued. Dee, sitting beside her, listened with rapt attention, clearly enjoying the tale. "He was the leader of one of the gangs, the most influential, dangerous, and brutal on the island," Zanar continued. "He saw potential in me and offered me shelter. In his family, there was a place for everyone, even an outcast like me. He was the first person who didn't despise me and gave me a chance. I began working for him. At first it was simple jobs. We would raid other gangs, rob wealthy lords and merchants who hoarded gold and mistreated the common people. I thought it was righteous work, even felt good about it. Roddy seemed like a true leader, a person of authority." His voice darkened. "But gradually the missions became more immoral. Attacking travelers who only wanted to move from one port to another in peace. Kidnapping families of rival gang members, holding them as hostages under inhumane conditions. I felt a true revolt in my heart the day Roddy ordered me and 4 others to burn alive the house of his older brother's family, whom he despised and from whom he had fled years before to form his own gang. I thought the brother would be there, that's why the order existed. But when we arrived, he wasn't home. Instead, his wife and 3 small children were inside. I thought it a mistake, but Redbeard Waller, one of Roddy's men, said this was the plan. The family was to die as a lesson for the brother. I protested. I wanted to leave, but they wouldn't let me. "If you run, Roddy will find you," one of them said. "And believe me, your fate will be 100 times worse than that family's." So we set the house on fire. But while my companions blocked every exit, I opened the back door, allowing them to escape. When Waller noticed the woman and children fleeing, he ran after them, and I followed. We reached the forest, where I caught up with him before he could harm them. We had no weapons, only the small knives every gang member carried. We fought as best we could. I struck him several times, but Waller was huge and strong. My blows were barely scratches. At one point, he threw me to the ground, pinning me beneath his weight. That's when it happened. Zaner's voice lowered, haunted. "You will remember this betrayal for the rest of your life," he said, and then he cut out my left eye. I thought I wouldn't survive. Then I heard a crash and felt his massive body slump aside. I could breathe again. Holding what remained of my eye, I saw Waller lying in the grass, a pool of blood around him. The mother dared to strike him with a large, sharp stone. He didn't survive. That's how it happened. I saved her. She saved me. Later it turned out Roddy's brother was influential and wealthy, and when he learned of my deed, he helped me escape the island to the Purple Isle. Alexandra sat in silence for a long moment, her expression a mixture of awe and respect. "That's why I said our past doesn't dictate our future actions," she said softly, voice tinged with admiration. Their conversation was kept alive by Didi. She smiled faintly, glancing between Alexandra and Zanar. "My lady," she said softly, "perhaps now you could tell us something. For instance, what is the capital like? I fear that neither of us has ever seen it. Except you." Alexandra chuckled quietly. "The capital, you say? My memory may deceive me a little. It's been quite some time since I left it for Naumburg." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the white horizon, as though the image of the city still shimmered somewhere far in the distance. "But one thing I remember clearly, it is beautiful. Breathtaking, even. Tangan is a city many believe was built by the ancient kings, yet under divine inspiration." Her voice softened, tinged with nostalgia. "It rises upon a great hill, surrounded by endless forests. The towers of its royal castle, the grand temples, and the tall-roofed halls reach so high that one can see the city rising above the treetops, miles before reaching its gates. The buildings are all made of pale stone, carved with thousands of delicate details. Arches that curve like the ribs of giants, windows framed by slender columns, spires so thin and tall they seem ready to pierce the clouds. Zanar listened in silence, a faint smirk on his lips, though even he seemed drawn in by her words. "There are countless markets and squares," Alexandra continued. "Gardens that bloom even in the early chill of spring, courtyards where fountains whisper at dusk, and streets so narrow that when you walk them at night, you can almost touch both walls with your hands. Everything about Tangani feels opulent, alive, every window glowing with golden light, every sound echoing like music. It's a place that never truly sleeps." Didi's eyes lit up. "It sounds like a dream." "It can feel that way," Alexandra admitted with a faint smile, "especially during the season of falling leaves. When the forests around the hill turn to pure gold, the city itself looks like the dwelling place of gods. The air smells of wood smoke and apples, and the towers gleam as if aflame." For a moment her voice faded, as though she herself had returned there in thought. "Tangani may not be as vast as Nandia and Cordell, or Morris on the Purple Isle, or even Lamara, the capital of Travia, she said at last. But to those who visit from beyond Drayan's borders, it leaves an impression few ever forget. Some fall in love with it so deeply they never wish to leave. They say the city has a way of keeping those who truly see it. The wagon rocked gently over the snow, and for a while, none of them spoke. The image of Tangani, its golden forests, its gleaming spires, its silent majesty, lingered in their thoughts, warming the chill of the winter road. Then, from beside the cart, Zainar's rough voice broke the silence. "Sounds like the kind of place that wouldn't let the likes of me past the gates," he said with a crooked grin. "A man missing an eye tends to ruin the view." Alexandra looked down at him, amused. "Perhaps you'd be surprised. Even the most beautiful cities have their shadows." "Good," Zaynar replied with a chuckle. "I've always felt more at home in the shadows." Didi giggled softly. "Maybe so, but I'd still love to see it one day," she said, her eyes bright with longing. "To walk through those streets, see the towers, the lights, maybe even stand at the castle gates." Zaynar glanced up at her, half smiling. "Careful what you wish for, girl. Big cities have a way of swallowing people whole." "Then I'll just have to hold on tight," she said cheerfully, straightening in her seat. Alexandra smiled faintly at the exchange. "Perhaps one day," she murmured, "you'll both see it with your own eyes." Outside, the wind howled softly over the snow, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter and distant dreams. Zaynar chuckled, glancing at Didi. "Your turn, little one." "My turn?" She blinked, tilting her head. "Tell us something interesting," he said, a teasing grin spreading beneath his stubbled jaw. Didi thought for a moment, her lips pursed in mock seriousness. "Have you ever heard the story of the night kissed by the sun?" Zaynar snorted. "What is that? A children's tale or a fantasy for lonely women?" Alexandra smiled softly. "Go on, Didi. I've never heard of it either." The girl's eyes brightened, and she sat a little straighter. Her voice softened, taking on a rhythm that sounded like something half-remembered from a fireside story. "They say," she began, "that a long time ago, on one of the royal isles, there lived a boy, born to a poor fisherman and his wife. He had nothing but a wooden toy sword, and dreams far too big for someone like him. Every morning, before the sun even rose, he would climb the hill behind his village and train alone, swinging that stick until his arms trembled. He swore that one day he'd become a knight, no matter what it took." Zaynar smirked quietly to himself, but said nothing. "When he turned 13, Didi continued, he left home without a word. His parents searched for him for weeks, but he was already gone, traveling from one island to another, working in ports and stables, sleeping under boats or in the shadows of castles. He crossed seas and kingdoms, always chasing his dream." Her eyes glinted in the dim light filtering through the wagon's curtains. "Until one day, he reached the lands of Cordell, and there he found work at the castle of a proud lord, a man known for his wealth, and 2 sons. One of them was kind and quiet. The other, well, he was the kind of man who believed the world itself bent to his will." Zaynar muttered, "Sounds familiar." Alexandra cast him a quick, amused glance, and Didi smiled faintly before continuing. "One afternoon, that arrogant son boasted before his father's men. He said he'd have his father knight any commoner who could defeat him in a duel. Everyone laughed, for no one dared to challenge him. He was strong, trained since childhood, and cruel enough to enjoy making others bleed. But then," Didi's voice lowered, "from the corner of the courtyard, a young stable boy stepped forward, covered in hay, his hands rough from work. He said, 'I'll fight you.'" Alexandra's lips curved into a small, intrigued smile. The men jeered, of course. The noble son grinned and accepted. And so, before sunset, the two faced each other on the training field. The boy had nothing but a dull practice sword and his courage. The noble swung with ease, mocking him, driving him into the dirt again and again. Each strike left him bruised, bleeding, and barely standing, but he would not yield. Every time he fell, he rose again. Didi's voice grew quieter, more vivid, as though she herself could see the scene unfold. And then, when he could barely hold his sword anymore, the sky suddenly changed. The clouds above them tore apart, as if ripped by unseen hands, and the sun burst through, so bright that it blinded everyone watching. The light struck the noble's blade, and for a heartbeat, it flared like fire. He cried out, stumbling, covering his eyes. Zaynar looked up from his horse, squinting as though picturing it himself. The boy saw his chance, Didi said. He swung one last time, weak but true, and struck the noble to the ground. Silence fell. No one moved. And then, from the dust and the sunlight, the stable boy stood victorious. The crowd could barely see him, the sun's rays falling on his face like a crown. She smiled softly. The Lord's son kept his word, and his father, amazed by the boy's courage, knighted him that very evening. From that day on, people called him the knight kissed by the sun. Some say the gods themselves chose him, for only he could stand beneath such light without being blinded. The wagon creaked softly in the snowbound silence that followed her words. Zaynar was the first to speak. So the boy wins, gets a shiny title, and lives happily ever after? Didi shrugged with a grin. That's how the story ends. He chuckled, shaking his head. Fairy tales always forget what happens after the ever after. Maybe, Alexandra said quietly, watching the snow drift past the window. But sometimes we need stories that end well. Zaynar tilted his head, half smiling. Maybe you're right, Princess. Maybe we do. The pale sun hung low above the horizon when the travelers finally reached the crossroads. The snow was thinner here, trampled by passing carts and hooves, but the air still carried the sharp bite of winter. Frost glittered on the wooden signpost that rose from the frozen ground, 3 weathered planks pointing in different directions. Taman pulled his horse to a stop and narrowed his eyes. The names were barely legible beneath the thin veil of ice. Ramburdia, Southway, and Tangen. Here, the Lord said, his voice steady but low. We'll stop for a while. The small procession slowed. Soldiers spread out, boots crunching in the snow, eyes scanning the edges of the silent forest. Behind them, the wagon came to a creaking halt. Didi pulled the reins tight, and Alexandra brushed aside the curtain to look out, her breath misting in the cold air. Ludwig, walking near the rear, let out a quiet sigh of relief and wiped frost from his brow. Zaynar swung off his horse, stretching his arms with a low groan. About time, he muttered under his breath. Thought we'd be riding till our bones turned to ice. He hadn't meant for anyone to hear, but Taman, dismounting nearby, caught the words. The Lord's expression didn't change. He simply adjusted his gloves and began checking the straps of his saddle, ignoring the remark entirely. Break for food and whatever else you need, Taman said firmly. But don't get too comfortable. We ride on soon. The group began to settle around the clearing. Horses snorted, pawing at the frost, while one of the guards gathered dry branches for a small fire. A crow croaked somewhere far off, its voice echoing through the skeletal trees. Alexandra stepped down from the wagon with Didi's help. The air bit at her cheeks as she crossed to where Taman stood by the signpost, his eyes tracing the 3 paths splitting before them. How long do you think it will take us to reach Tangen? She asked softly. Taman glanced her way. If we stay on course and keep a steady pace, 3 days, perhaps a little more. But if we start wasting daylight, we won't get there in a week. There was a hint of frustration in his tone. He hated delays. If it were up to him, they'd have ridden through the night, and stopped only to sleep. Alexandra smiled faintly. "You know well that not everyone is as tireless as you are, my lord." He met her gaze, the corner of his mouth twitching almost into a smile. But then he turned back toward the signpost, his jaw tightening again. Behind them, Zanar crouched near the half-lit fire, his gaze drifting to the plank that pointed west, toward Rambertia. He said nothing, but the faint smirk tugging at his lips made it clear enough. That was his road. Meanwhile, Ludwig had slipped away from the group, heading a short distance into the forest to see to his own needs. The air was sharp and still, and every step he took crunched softly beneath the snow. Bare branches reached overhead like bony fingers, their dark shapes etched against the pale sky. As he walked, his thoughts turned once more to the tightly rolled parchment hidden beneath his shirt. He could feel it pressed against his chest. A small, fragile thing, yet heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Was it something connected in some way to the seventh legacy, the same mystery the Lord had asked him about back in the cell? Or perhaps a matter of state, a secret so powerful it could alter the course of the new lands themselves? The urge to look was unbearable. Now, while no one's watching, he thought, glancing back toward the camp, he reached beneath his shirt, fingertips brushing the parchment's edge, when suddenly a firm hand landed on his shoulder. Ludwig spun around. Lord Taman stood behind him, silent, his gaze hard and unreadable. "Not yet, Ludwig," he said quietly, his tone calm, but edged with warning. "It's not time." For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. Ludwig opened his mouth to speak, but the Lord had already turned away, striding back toward the clearing without another word. Frustration boiled inside him. Why doesn't he want me to know? He followed a short while later, brushing past the trees until the campfire smoke came back into view. The others were already gathering, unaware of what had just transpired in the woods. Still, the thought refused to leave him. The weight beneath his shirt seemed heavier than before, pulsing faintly with meaning he could not yet grasp. Was that why she had sent him here? Perhaps she wanted him to become part of something greater. A story vast and significant, whose continuation was, for now, hidden from his eyes. When they were about to leave the forest, Ludwig suddenly froze. A faint sound, a muffled crack of snow, like a step behind him, broke the stillness. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing, his hand sliding beneath his cloak to rest on the hilt of his sword. The woods behind him stood motionless. Only a few flakes drifted from a nearby branch, settling on the ground like pale feathers. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Probably just snow falling, he told himself, though his pulse remained quickened. Together with Taman, he stepped out of the trees. Behind them, the forest was silent once more, but for a fleeting moment it felt as though something unseen lingered there, watching them go. The group was nearly ready to set out again. Horses snorted and stamped the snow, breath curling in the cold air. Alexandra was already seated in the carriage. Ludwig stood near the rear, tightening the straps on one of the wagons, and Didi adjusted her cloak against the chill wind. Only Lord Taman remained apart from the others, standing a short distance away with Zanar. Their voices carried low, meant for no one but themselves. "Remember," Taman said quietly, his gaze firm. "Kanar must never learn that he's being watched. Even if you're discovered, you cannot reveal who sent you. Is that clear?" Zanar smirked, the corner of his mouth lifting beneath the faint shadow of his beard. "Don't worry, my lord. The only way I'd be found out is if I wanted to be. When I'm meant to be a shadow, following a man's every step," he tapped the patch over his missing eye, "become one." Taman regarded him for a moment longer, unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "Good. I trust I won't regret this." He reached beneath his cloak and produced a small leather pouch. The weight of coin clinked softly as he handed it over. "Here, the first half. You'll receive the rest once the task is complete. Zayner's grin widened as he caught the pouch in one hand, weighing it as if judging its worth. Well, they weren't lying. You're as generous as they say, Lord. See that you earn the rest, Taman replied curtly. Now go. The sooner you reach Ramberta, the better. Zaynar gave a mock salute, then swung himself into the saddle of his dark bay horse. Snow scattered under the hooves as he turned the animal toward the western road. For a brief moment he looked back, his lone eye glinting faintly in the pale light. Then he spurred the horse forward and disappeared down the path between the trees. Taman watched him go until the last sound of hooves faded into silence. Then he turned, his expression once again composed, and strode back toward the others. Without a word, he mounted his white steed, took the reins in hand, and motioned for the caravan to move. The small procession began its slow advance once more, northward toward the rising hills. The snow had thinned as the company followed the winding road through the forest. The light between the trees shimmered pale and cold when Taman raised his hand for the group to slow. Up ahead, a small band of travelers appeared, about a dozen figures, wrapped in thick, weathered cloaks and leaning on wooden staffs. Their steps were slow and heavy, their clothes dusted white with frost. Pilgrims, one of the guards murmured. When the two groups met, the man at the head of the pilgrims greeted them with a deep bow. "Peace upon your road, travelers," he said with a weary smile. "We are pilgrims bound for the holy city. We seek only safe passage, and perhaps the kindness of company on this lonely road." Taman studied the man for a moment, then nodded curtly. "So be it. But keep to your line, and don't fall behind." Soon one of the pilgrims walked beside him. He was middle-aged, with sunken eyes and a voice worn thin by cold. As they moved through the snow, he told Taman of their journey, how they had come from the southern isles, through the stormy coast, seeking the blessing of the gods in the royal capital. Ludwig, walking a few paces behind, listened quietly. At first, the man's tale sounded ordinary enough, but as it went on, the knight began to notice cracks. Names that didn't match, directions that contradicted themselves, strange pauses when the pilgrim was pressed for detail. His brow furrowed slightly, though he said nothing. Outside the covered wagon, several of the pilgrims walked alongside, their boots crunching softly in the snow. Inside, Didi sat opposite Alexandra, the rhythmic creak of the wheels and the faint murmur of voices beyond the canvas filling the air. Curious, she lifted a small corner of the curtain to glance outside, and froze. One of the pilgrims walking nearest to the wagon, a tall man with thick black hair and a scar running down his cheek, was staring directly at her. His lips curled into a faint, knowing smile before he gave her a slow, deliberate wink. Didi's hand trembled as she let the curtain fall back into place. Her heart quickened, a chill running through her despite the warmth of the enclosed space. She turned her eyes to Alexandra, forcing a smile, pretending nothing had happened. But the image of that man's face lingered, sharp as a blade. Another pilgrim, a woman with a scarf wrapped tightly around her head, drew closer to Alexandra and began to ask questions. Many questions. About their journey, their destination, their purpose in the capital. The princess tried to answer politely at first, but the woman's curiosity soon grew unsettling. Then a sudden gust of wind swept through the road, pulling at cloaks and hoods. For a heartbeat, the fabric of one pilgrim's mantle lifted, and Didi's eyes caught something gleaming beneath. Steel. A sword strapped across his chest, several knives at his belt, glinting in the pale light before the cloak fell back into place. Her breath caught sharply. She froze where she sat, hands gripping the edge of the seat. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she dared not make a sound. Slowly, she nudged Alexandra's arm. The princess looked at her, puzzled, until Didi tilted her head ever so slightly toward the armed pilgrim. Alexandra followed her gaze. Her eyes widened at once, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Alexandra leaned slightly out of the wagon and called, her voice steady but tense. "Husband! We need to stop for a moment." The caravan slowed. Taman turned in his saddle, frowning, as she climbed down and walked toward him through the snow. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. When she was close enough, Alexandra smiled faintly, glancing toward the pilgrim beside her husband. "It isn't something I can say out loud," she murmured. Taman's expression hardened, but he leaned in. "Taman, they're armed," she whispered. "They're not who they say they are." For the briefest instant, his eyes widened. Then he recovered, speaking aloud with feigned indifference. "Of course, my dear. If you must, then go on. But don't wander too far. Take Dee Dee with you." He gave her a deliberate look, one only she would understand. The pilgrim beside him raised a brow. "Is everything all right, my lord?" "Yes," Taman said easily, smiling. "Just women's needs. You know how it is." Alexandra turned back toward the wagon, but when she looked inside, her heart stopped. Empty. She stepped around it, and there, behind the wagon, she saw him, the black-haired man with the scar, his arm clamped around Dee Dee, a blade pressed against her throat. Alexandra froze, her breath caught in terror. Before she could move, the veiled woman who had spoken to her before came up silently behind and whispered against her ear. "Stay quiet, princess, or she dies first." Taman scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for Alexandra, but the princess had vanished from view. "Looking for something, lord?" a pilgrim's voice asked casually beside him. Before Taman could respond, Ludwig slipped silently behind the man, pressing a dagger against his ribs. "You're heading to the Temple of the Five, you said. You should have prepared better. In the capital, only one of the five is worshipped, Ross." The pilgrim's eyes widened in sudden realization. In an instant he drew a hidden weapon and turned, engaging Ludwig in deadly combat. Metal clashed, sparks flying in the crisp air. Taman reacted immediately, drawing his sword as two other pilgrims attacked him. Taman's men were already fighting fiercely, but the pilgrims moved with practiced precision, striking with the skill of professional assassins. Behind the wagon, Dee Dee's eyes widened as the black-haired man with the scar held her firmly, pressing a knife to her neck. Her skin prickled with fear, but instinct took over. With all her strength, she lashed out, striking him hard in the groin. He groaned, stumbling, momentarily loosening his grip on her, and taking the knife away from her throat as he clutched himself. "Ah, you naughty girl! Playing with fire!" he shouted, his voice rough with pain, yet burning with anger, as Dee Dee darted away. At the same time, the woman who had been questioning Alexandra suddenly grabbed the princess's wrist and pressed a knife against her cheek. "Tell me where it is, princess, or I'll tear that pretty face to pieces." "What are you talking about? I don't understand." Alexandra's voice trembled. "Don't play the fool. I know you have it with you." The assassin spat, voice even more aggressive. A loud clang interrupted her, and the woman was cut down from behind by one of Taman's soldiers. "Run, your highness!" the soldier yelled. Alexandra seized Dee Dee's hand, and the two bolted into the forest. The black-haired man and another assassin gave chase. For a while, Alexandra and Dee Dee managed to put some distance between themselves and their pursuers, the crunch of snow under their feet echoing through the silent forest. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying the distant shouts of battle and the occasional clash of steel. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, but for a few precious moments, it seemed as if they might escape. Suddenly, Dee Dee's foot caught on a hidden root buried under the snow, and she tumbled forward. Alexandra's hand slipped from hers as she cried out, panic surging through her. "Dee Dee!" Alexandra shouted, her voice tight with fear. Dee Dee's eyes widened as she saw the two men closing in on them, moving faster than expected through the snow-laden trees. Heart hammering in her chest, she shouted back, Run, my lady! Leave me! For a brief moment Alexandra hesitated, torn between staying with her loyal companion and escaping the pursuing threat. But then she saw the second assassin barreling toward her, and instinct took over. She turned and fled, vanishing among the trees. Left momentarily exposed, Didi scrambled to her knees, forcing herself to rise, her breath ragged. And then she saw him. The tall, black-haired man with matted hair and eyes burning with cruel intent, closing in on her with terrifying speed. Fear gripped her like iron, freezing her momentarily. As he reached her, their eyes met. In his gaze, Didi saw the monster within. Brutal, unfeeling, utterly inhuman. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but it was too late. With a swift, brutal motion, the man grabbed her and hoisted her over his shoulder like a sack, her struggles flailing uselessly. "Come on, little one, let's have some fun," he growled, a horrifying smile twisting his lips. Suddenly, a blur of steel flashed through the air. Ludwig burst from between the trees, his blade gleaming in the pale light as it carved through the assassin in one swift, merciless arc. The man didn't even have time to scream. His body split, falling heavily into the snow with a dull, wet thud. Didi tumbled from his grasp, landing hard in the drifts, her breath torn from her chest. For a moment she just stared, wide-eyed, trembling, at the crimson stains spreading across the white ground. Then Ludwig was beside her, his gloved hand gripping hers firmly. "Come on," he urged, pulling her to her feet. They ran together through the trees, snow crunching beneath their boots, the air thick with mist and the metallic scent of blood. Ahead, Alexandra stumbled, trying to push herself upright, but another assassin had reached her first, blade raised for the killing blow. Ludwig didn't hesitate. He lunged forward with a roar, his sword plunging clean through the man's back, bursting out through his chest. The assassin's eyes went wide with shock before his body went limp and crumpled into the snow. Panting, Ludwig wrenched the sword free, crimson steaming against the frost. He reached for Alexandra's arm, steadying her as she swayed. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, breathless, still pale from the shock. "Good. Then move," Ludwig barked, glancing over his shoulder. "No, wait. We can't leave them there. They'll find the thing we're carrying," Alexandra shouted, fear and urgency in her voice. "Don't worry, my lady. I've got it with me." "Now we're the targets, so we have to move before they catch up," Ludwig replied. "You have it?" Alexandra asked, astonished. All along the journey she had wondered why Ludwig, instead of riding in armor like a proper knight, traveled on foot. "That was your husband's plan, princess. I'll explain later." "Now, no time to talk," Ludwig said, grabbing both her and Didi by the hands, urging them forward. Meanwhile, the clash of steel and screams still echoed along the blood-stained road. Taman fought like a cornered beast, his blade flashing through the whirling snow and chaos. Every strike was driven by fury and instinct, yet the storm of violence grew too thick, too wild to control. Then came the blow. A crushing impact struck the side of his head, and pain burst through his skull like a wave of white fire. The world spun. His vision split into fragments of red and white. He staggered, breath torn from his chest, before collapsing to his knees, and then into the snow. The cold bit into his cheek. The noise of battle dimmed, fading into a dull, distant hum. Somewhere nearby, a voice cried out, desperate, strangled. Taman's eyelids flickered open. Through the haze, shadows wavered before him. And there, rising from the drifting mist, he saw it. The same dark presence that had haunted him once before, in the shattered ruins of the Dead Isles. A shape woven of smoke and shadow, shifting with every breath of wind, as though the darkness itself had taken form. It loomed over one of his men. The soldier writhed helplessly, gasping for air, while the entity's hands, black, spectral, and weightless, tightened around his throat. Who are you? The man rasped, his voice cracking with terror. The shadow leaned closer, its edges rippling like oil across water. From within it came a voice, deep and hollow, as though spoken from the depths of the earth itself. I am the one who brings forth chaos. The soldier's body jerked once, then fell limp into the snow. The dark figure seemed to dissolve into mist, scattering with the wind until nothing remained. Taman tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave way. His vision dimmed, fading into swirling blackness. The last thing he saw was the still form of his fallen comrade. And then, at last, darkness swallowed him whole. The three of them ran without looking back, snow crunching beneath their boots, branches clawing at their cloaks. Breath tore from their lungs like smoke. Behind them, the forest swallowed the road and all the screams that still echoed in memory. Only when the sounds of pursuit had long faded did Ludwig slow his pace. They emerged beside a narrow river, its dark water still moving despite the frost. The current was swift, biting at the stones. For the first time since the attack, silence surrounded them, save for the gurgle of the stream and their ragged breathing. Alexandra sank down onto a large rock, her hands trembling as she brushed away the frost that had gathered on her cloak. Didi hurried to her side. "My lady, are you hurt?" the girl asked softly. "Me?" Alexandra's tone was sharp, but beneath it trembled relief. "Didi, you were the one who nearly—" Her voice faltered. She looked away, angry at herself for the tears burning her eyes. A few steps away, Ludwig knelt by the riverbank. He dipped his blade into the icy current, watching as the blood swirled away like smoke in water. Then he washed his hands and splashed his face, the cold biting deep, forcing him to stay alert. "What do we do now?" Didi asked quietly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Alexandra exhaled, staring into the moving water. "We must reach the capital. Somehow." "No," Ludwig said firmly, rising to his feet. "We're not going to the capital. If they ambushed us on the road, then whoever sent them already knows our destination. He won't let us get that far." Didi looked between them, her voice trembling. "But, my lady, your husband, our lord—" "Don't worry," Alexandra interrupted gently. "Taman is strong. He's fought his way out of death more times than I can count." She took Didi's hands in her own, her grip steady despite the fear in her eyes. Ludwig turned to them, his expression dark. "Then we must reach the nearest stronghold of your order," Alexandra said. "They'll know what to do with the 7th legacy." Ludwig froze. The words hung in the air like frost. "The 7th legacy," he murmured. "So it truly exists." He stepped closer to her. "Your Highness, you need to listen to me carefully. If that parchment really is the 7th legacy, we cannot take it to the Order." Alexandra frowned. "What? Why not? Isn't that what your kind swore to protect?" "First of all," he said, his tone low but steady, "there is no my kind. I am no longer one of them. I left the Order years ago. And second, because the Order can no longer be trusted. It's rotted from within, corrupted by ambition, by shadow. There are those among them who would use the legacy for their own ends. We can't trust them. In truth, we can't trust anyone." The princess stared at him as though he had just spoken blasphemy. "Ludwig, what are you saying? Did the Order not send you at my husband's request?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I made sure the man they did send never reached Naumburg. The Order already knew why your husband wrote to them. Somehow they had learned he'd found something of great value. The man they sent was ordered to take it, kill your husband, and silence anyone who knew. I didn't know what it was at first, but now I understand why they wanted it so badly." Alexandra's lips parted, her breath caught halfway between disbelief and horror. "If you are not one of them," she whispered. Then how do you know all this? I had a source, Ludwig replied. Someone who sent me to you. My task was to keep you safe, and to make sure that thing never fell into the Order's hands. I wouldn't be surprised if they were behind the attack tonight. Alexandra's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she took a step toward him. A source? She repeated sharply. And how am I supposed to know your source can be trusted? Or that you can? Now that we know you're not truly one of the Knight's followers, we have no reason to believe a single word you say. We know nothing about you, Ludwig. A tense silence followed, heavy as the cold air around them. Then, softly but firmly, Didi spoke. My lady, she said, her voice trembling, yet steady with conviction. We can trust him. What he's saying. It's the truth. Alexandra turned to her, confused and weary. Didi, what could you possibly know of this? I know I don't understand much of what's happening, but there's one thing I'm sure of. She looked straight at Ludwig, then back at Alexandra. He's someone we can trust. The princess pressed her hand to her forehead, as though trying to steady her thoughts against the storm of fear and disbelief. The forest around them creaked and sighed in the cold, the sound of the river the only thing that tethered them to the world. They stood by the riverbank, breath clouding in the frigid air. The forest around them was silent now, save for the rush of the unfrozen stream that cut through the snow like a dark vein. We need to disappear for a while, Ludwig said finally, breaking the heavy silence. His tone was calm, but his eyes still darted through the trees, watchful. Hide somewhere, blend in with the crowd. A place where no one will expect to find us, where we can rest and decide what comes next. For a moment, neither Alexandra nor Didi spoke. Only the sound of the river filled the space between them. Then the princess straightened, her voice clear and resolute. Ramburdia, she said. Ludwig turned toward her. Ramburdia? That's in the opposite direction of the capital. Yes, Alexandra replied. And that's exactly why it's safe. The Winter Games are being held there this season. Thousands of people from every corner of the kingdom will be flooding the streets. We can lose ourselves in the crowd. She paused, meeting his gaze. My uncle governs the city. He will shelter us for a time, and help us if we need to flee again. Ludwig considered her words, the wind tugging at his cloak. Finally, he nodded. That may not be such a foolish idea after all. Then suddenly he turned, his eyes narrowing as he gazed back toward the forest they had fled. The dark line of trees whispering in the wind, still heavy with danger. Now, he said quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The only challenge left is reaching that city alive.